Part 3. Dunquin to the Cape of Good Hope. Chapter 19. Africa, the Sahara Desert. Like some unstable explosive, the machismo produced by the combination of Arab and Italian mentality in Tunis was the worst Tabitha had ever encountered. Men leered at her, followed her when she was out alone, and made obscene noises in her direction. In the street, she was deliberately jostled. Even though the majority of Tunisian women wore Western dress, her black leather jacket and sunglasses probably screamed loose Western blonde. Moreover, we arrived in November 1990, a couple of months before the Allies began bombing Iraq, and the air crackled with political tension. Tunis was a haven for Islamic political activists from the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was a modern city, the Switzerland of the Arab world, and a meeting place for many Islamic supporters whom the West considered criminal. 10 miles away to the northeast stood Carthage. Over the past 3,000 years, the name alone has evoked terror, dread, envy, respect, and wonder throughout the world. The idea of seeing such a fabled city was as awesome as seeing the Gobi, Siberia, the Sahara, the Andes, or the Strait of Magellan, all of which I'd read about, studied, and wondered over, never expecting to see. Carthage was a maritime republic founded by Queen Dido from the Phoenician city of Tyre. Its near 1,000-year rule in the western Mediterranean was challenged by Rome in the 3 Punic Wars. Rome decided that Carthage must be destroyed. The struggle ended in 146 BC with the achievement of Cato the censor's dictum, Delenda est Carthago. A siege of 3 years climaxed in a battle that raged for 17 days. The Romans leveled the city, then plowed up the ground and laced it with salt to make sure their enemies were utterly without resources. The reality of the small site that was the remains of Carthage contrasted sharply to whatever I'd expected after several thousand years of historical references. Despite the dominance Carthage had held over the ancient world, the Romans had done such a thorough job of demolishing it, for centuries even using the city's foundations as a quarry, that its ruins were disappointing. Most of what there was to see was Roman, not Carthaginian, and there wasn't much of that. It was hard to believe that such a meager port, 2 small basins, had been used by a navy that had ruled its world. From here, however, Hannibal's legions set out for Europe, eventually to cross the Alps and challenge Rome. The southern harbor was the center of commercial shipping, at which the Carthaginians were superb. The northern one was the naval base, and the island in its center, Carthage's naval headquarters. To my amazement, historians reported that as many as 220 warships could be anchored there. The city's location over the bay was magnificent, but at its peak, its population couldn't have been more than 20,000. In the same way that I was so forcibly struck by the early inhabitants of Samarkand, Moscow, and Xi'an, I wondered who they were and how they had done so much. All I could figure out was that expert sailors in small ships could achieve dominance if everyone else was struggling in small boats and canoes. 200 years after the Roman sack, Carthage was again one of the Mediterranean's great cities. From 439 AD to 533 AD, it was the capital of the Vandal kingdom, a status it kept even after the Byzantine reconquest and up to its next sack by the Arabs in 697 AD. The history of Tunis was far less imposing. The Carthaginian stronghold of Tynes, destroyed with Carthage, rose again as Tunes, a small but prosperous Roman and then Byzantine town. In the 9th century AD, the 4th Aghlabid ruler, Ibrahim Ahmed I, made it his home. The modern French portion of the city was plain and functional, with few interesting features. Here Islam took a liberal form. In wandering around the new part of the city, it was hard to tell that we were in a Muslim country, let alone in Africa. To me, the combination of nearby ruins and this functional, unhurried city was yet another vivid lesson in how nothing was permanent. As this was the hometown of the PLO in exile, we kept a low profile. To keep even more out of sight, we had new license plates made. Our new plates gave our proper license numbers, but neglected to include Alabama or in what country we were registered. Since this was the norm throughout the world, no one noticed. The trek across the Sahara Desert loomed before us, another challenge of motorcycle touring. The size of the lower 48 United States, the Sahara is the largest desert on the planet, 2,000 miles north to south, as far east to west as Los Angeles is from Washington, D.C. At its northern and southern edges lie paved roads, while at its heart are nearly 500 miles of lifeless dunes and rocks without any sort of road, paved or unpaved, across which we had to drive. We planned to go along the edge of the Grand Erg Occidental, or Great Western Sea of Sand, which anywhere else in the world would have been a first-class desert in its own right. Here, it was only 7,000 square miles of rock and sand in the midst of a wasteland scores of times larger. 6,000 years before, the Sahara had been a savanna, much like today's East Africa. In fact, before the 5th century BC, hunter-gatherers had roamed here. In Roman times, the inhabitants had herded animals and took up a more settled existence. Before the Christian era, horses had been used for transportation. Only afterward, as the region turned into desert, did the camel become dominant. Here was another example of nature doing what man today is often accused of doing, ruining the environment. If the Sierra Club had been around, it would have obtained a court order from the Supreme Pliocene Court to keep the Grand Canyon from eroding a perfectly good tract of western real estate. Although it stretched across all the countries of North Africa, most of the Sahara was in Algeria, a country 3 times the size of Texas, yet 5/6 of which was taken up by the desert. Only 10% of the country's 26 million people lived in this vast wasteland. To get to, and then across it, posed one of the great challenges of modern travel. It was not for those who needed their comforts, for in the Sahara proper, there were not only no roads, but also no hotels, no gas stations, and no restaurants. Every means of transport across it was rough, for no railroad or bus crossed it. Its climate ranged from fiercely hot to fiercely cold. Except for occasional oases, there was no water and no food. Its trails ranged from awful to non-existent. We bought hats with large brims, water cans, gas cans, and dates, a desert traveler's standby which didn't spoil. I wanted to buy or hook up with a truck and a driver with whom we could travel south, since for this leg of the trip it made sense to have backup transportation, as well as an extra supply of gas, food, and water. Just as we hadn't wanted to cross Siberia in the winter, we didn't want to cross the Sahara in the summer, when the temperatures would overheat the bikes, and us. I was looking forward to the trip as one of the great thrills of my motorcycling life. Tabitha had a sense of dread, as if she were sure something was going to go spectacularly wrong. I couldn't decide if her female intuition was operating on target or working overtime. We cranked up and drove to Algeria. We passed European military cemeteries from wars, insurrections, and rebellions of long ago, acres of uniform white crosses, each well maintained. It was a surprise to come upon them, and it made us sad to think of young English and French men buried in the desert, thousands of miles from the green fields of home. And for what? I know their descendants did not have a clue as to what they had died for. In many cases, they didn't even know that great-great-great-grandfather Pierre had died in some supposedly noble but forgotten cause. Who remembers today that Napoleon, out to topple the divinely crowned heads of Europe, bringing terror from revolutionary France, had been hated far and wide? Can any of us say why countless thousands died in the 18th century's Polish-Swedish War? Back then, the Polish and Swedish kings had ruled important empires, but today, not only have those dynasties vanished, the borders that so many 20-year-olds died to preserve have changed and changed again. That we view such a war as a joke today in itself displays the sweep of history. On this trip, we stumbled across the artifacts of scores of ancient wars. Few, if any, of those wars seemed worth dying for. If history is a natural panorama of changing borders and shifting centers of power, why should 20-year-olds die to speed up or slow this inexorable process? My anti-war fervor began back at Oxford. I often passed a stone passageway at Balliol on which were carved the names of hundreds of English youths, captains and lieutenants, killed in World War I. At the end of the passageway was another section filled with names, those of German students at Balliol killed in the same war. In 1905, England and Germany were the fastest of allies, as evidenced by the number of German youths sent to Balliol to study. Yet by 1914, they were at each other's throats. It seemed absurd. On another night, I was singing and drinking with a group of Spanish friends, 22-year-olds like me, when the thought struck me that if my government decided it was the thing to do, I could be shooting these drinking companions in a matter of weeks. I was horrified. That night something in me shifted. I've never been able to see the utility of war in the same way as before. The city of Algiers was bigger and older than Tunis. To Tabitha's eye, it didn't look as interesting as Cairo, although it did have a Casbah. Many of us know the Casbah from 1940s films, a marketplace surrounded by old buildings, overhead passageways, and screened-in balconies. During the Algerian Revolution, the rebels darted into it as if the French were cats, and it was a mouse hole. As visas are perishable, it was impossible on a trip like this to obtain them all beforehand. Here in Algiers, we began to collect the rest we'd need for our route to Cape Town, those for the Central African Republic and Cameroon. We hunted up the Zairian embassy, which took 2 days of searching to find. At last we found the house of the ambassador himself, and his embassy turned out to be across the street. Economically, Algeria was a real mess, another statist government that had misfired. It wasn't a small economy, as African nations went, $53 billion in gross domestic product, with a per capita GDP of $2,170. In comparison, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, had a per capita GDP of $400, compared with the major industrial countries' GDP of nearly $12,000. However, the socialists had mismanaged their potential riches from their huge oil and gas reserves. In reference to statism, I certainly don't want to be misunderstood. I'm no anarchist. There are many legitimate functions governments must handle, mostly involving public safety, such as those of national defense, police and fire protection, air traffic, the inspection of buildings and food, and flood control. It's just that after a century of experiments, we can now see clearly that governments are terrible at engendering prosperity and wealth. Algeria is a prime example. During the 60s and 70s, it was touted by many as a model for third world liberation movements. The socialist government attended to social welfare needs while the economy grew rapidly. But now, we can see this was not the result of good management, but of rising oil prices. What appeared then to be sound economic policy was actually one more case of a country riding the commodities boom of the 70s. Today, petroleum and natural gas account for 95% of Algeria's foreign exchange earnings. When the price of oil fell, the country was socked hard. At one time, it was self-sufficient in food production, but now it is highly dependent on imports. Algeria's unemployment is at 25%, inflation more than 20%, and its people need housing. A couple of years before we were there, spiraling prices and shortages had led to riots in which the army shot hundreds of people. The widespread sense that government officials are corrupt continues to this day. The black market is rampant. Virtually nothing from the outside comes in, not even Western newspapers and magazines. The country had one of the most absurd currencies we'd encountered. On the black market, we could get 30 dinars for our dollars, while the official rate was 10 to 1. This large discrepancy told me that the government had run its nutty economic policies about as far and as long as it could. At a 200% premium, it was worth everybody's while to change money on the black market, whereas, at say a 20% premium, otherwise law-abiding people would be reluctant to break the law. Because nobody was allowed to bring in outside goods legitimately, it was difficult to find any. The country had an external debt of $20 billion, which was serviced by most of its hard currency earnings. If the central bank had had extra hard currency, legitimate merchants could have bought Sony TVs, cars, Italian shoes, and New Zealand lamb and sold them to legitimate customers. But since its hard currency was being used to service the debt, the central bank had none. Merchants imported virtually nothing, and everybody was suffering. Compounding their economic problems were low gasoline prices because of price controls, which encouraged wasteful consumption, just as low bread prices had encouraged boys in the Soviet Union to use state-baked loaves for footballs. To dampen demand here, the government should have sold gasoline at world market prices and shipped all it could overseas for much-needed hard currency. These economic problems were the principal reason for the rise of Islamic fundamentalism here. The Algerian people were looking for somebody to blame for this mess. As always, they had to have a scapegoat, such as the government or Westerners. Since Westerners had been gone since the early 60s and the secular socialists had run things for the 3 decades since, the people said, "It's the fault of those godless ones." Not having allowed an entrepreneurial sector to develop, the statist government was now faced with the choice of either continuing its policies, import and currency restrictions, or devaluing the currency, which would make not only import prices but also domestic prices rise sharply. Continued restrictions, on the other hand, would naturally lead to a larger and larger currency premium on the black market. Eventually, no hard currency would be left in the country, which would mean nothing could be brought in from the outside world, as nobody wanted dinars. Since the economy didn't produce much, certainly nothing to match Japanese cars, Italian shoes, and New Zealand lamb, life would become yet tougher on the people. Finally, the government would be forced to devalue the dinar, but that, of course, in a single shock, would make foreign and domestic goods that much more expensive. So the government had arrived at a point where it thought it could do nothing that was not political suicide. I knew its only hope now was to have a freely convertible currency, and to try to weather the political storm that sudden massive price increases brought. At least at that point goods would again become available. At the end of their rope, forced by the marketplace to face a similar situation, Polish politicians had done this. Their people, like the Algerians, produced little and could import nothing. They made the currency convertible, and it had worked. The conversion rate of the Polish zloty skyrocketed, but it didn't matter, because this new high level was what the real rate was. Goods poured in, the government survived, and everything had been fine. Unfortunately, the Poles hadn't had staying power. They and their ivory tower Western advisers had been so sure democracy would cure their ills. All you had to do was look at the U.S. and Germany to see that democracy meant enormous prosperity, that they hadn't seen the need to take other measures. Yes, Marlboro cigarettes and Toyotas were available, but they hadn't realized that they needed to sell something to the outside world to pay for these new cigarettes and cars. Decades of shoddy workmanship, mismanagement, and little capital investment meant the Poles weren't efficient producers of much that the outside world wanted. Still, the government felt it couldn't fire the unproductive workers on its payroll. It feared that would have been another form of political suicide. So it printed money to pay these workers, expecting with childlike faith that any day democracy would explode into prosperity. These wheelbarrows full of money made the whole mess start all over again. Inflation came back. Since the government now couldn't go back to exchange controls and nobody wanted the yet more worthless zloty, its value eroded again. Once you start printing money without anything behind it, nobody ever wants it. The public ain't that dumb. Even if you call it money, Nobody's going to buy something without real value. Around me, I sensed Algeria was seething and ready to explode. Yes, it was tightly restricted now, but how long would this last? Here was another country where socialism and the revolution had failed badly. As in the Soviet Union, the people were going to demand a big change. As we drove toward the Sahara, we passed more Roman ruins. The village markets were lush with produce, big mounds of pomegranates, dates, pears, and apples, but little else. Gradually, the surrounding countryside became more desert-like. The closer we drew to the Sahara, the more expensive the markets became. Only gas, controlled by the government, was cheap, a fraction of European prices, and a third of that at black market rates. The Sahara proper began 400 miles south of Algiers. Tabitha was still uneasy, but I was growing excited. I'd always enjoyed traveling through deserts. There was a romance to them, a poetry of starkness. A desert like this was like a tough market. It did not forgive mistakes, and it forced you to be attentive, to be fully awake. And God, was it beautiful. Moving steadily south, we carried all the water we could, and extra food and gas. The terrain became drier and rougher. Vegetation became sparse. Gas stations were farther apart. The landscape became more and more inhospitable to animals and plants alike. 2 days of southerly driving brought us to the Imzab, a scrubby valley occupied by the Mozabites, a puritanical Islamic sect. The people of this valley lived in a pentapolis, 5 villages that had developed independently of the country. We stopped in the main town, Gardeia. Like the other 4, it was built on a hill and crowned by a distinctive, unadorned minaret. We weren't allowed to enter Beni Izguin, or the Pious, the religious town of the Imzab. We had passed from the urban civilization of Algiers, where few women wore veils, into such fundamentalist backcountry that the women exposed no more of themselves than one eye, which could be seen through a fold in the cotton cloth that covered them from head to foot. We stayed on a hill overlooking the town in the 3-star Hotel Rosamides. We'd been on reasonably good 2-lane blacktop, but the ocean of sand we were about to plunge into kept looming before us. Still looking for someone to carry extra provisions, we drove out to the local campsite. We moved from truck to Land Rover, asking who was going south, who would carry gear and supplies for a few dollars. We met a French graduate student called Pierre, who was going our way and needed extra cash. We'd form a partnership. In return for our paying his expenses, he was delighted to carry our tents, spare tires, water cans, and fuel cans in a battered pickup truck whose grill and lights were shielded by steel bull bars. His pockmarked face had a ready smile, and he seemed charming and civilized. He would make a fine traveling companion. Over the next 3 days, our small caravan covered 1,000 miles along a desert road that was mostly paved, the easy part of the trip. And what a desert! What finely sculpted dunes and daring sand formations! Hour after hour, mile after mile, the dunes' elegance, grace, and voluptuousness bore down on us. The monotonous beauty wore down my ordinary way of looking at the world. Molded by the wind's harsh caresses into daring waves no sculptor or engineer could dream of duplicating, the dunes began to remind me of the sensuous curves and swooping arcs of Tabitha's body. Early in December, we reached Tamanrasset, the fabled jumping-off city on the northern edge of the roughest part of the desert. Named after a famous beautiful woman, it was the geographical center of the Sahara. Tamanrasset is one of my favorite towns, a jumble of Land Rovers, mud houses, and hardened desert travelers. We stayed here several days to rest. Even though it was newly built, clean, and active, goats wandered the streets. Along with donkeys, camels were parked outside modern houses. The supermarket offered mainly canned food, peaches, and meat. Most of the locals were extraordinary in appearance, with stately turbans and white robes. From time to time, the Tuareg, The nomadic blue-robed Berbers of the Sahara sailed through on camels. These tribespeople went back and forth across the border between Niger and Algeria, not recognizing any national boundaries and proving the absurdity of having borders in the middle of the desert. Originally, Tamanrasset had been an outpost of the French Foreign Legion. In 1950, it had 30 people, but now it had 30,000, a real boom town. It was a major crossroads for long-distance African travelers. Everybody traveling on the continent was either here, had just been here, or was due to arrive. Camaraderie sprang up between travelers as we shared maps and travel stories. Watch out for the owner of the Antelope in Nigeria. Stay at the Moon Inn in Zimbabwe. This road here is washed out. Take the route through the mountains. The hotel bar was a good place to hang out, one of the few in Tam where you could get a cold beer, or as close to cold as you could find in an Islamic desert. Pierre joined us with a Malian woman he had picked up at the campground. We swapped tips with Makoto Yamamoto, a Japanese who had spent 11 months traveling around Africa. Another Japanese we met had been a student in Africa for 2 years and was now visiting as many African countries as he could pack in. We met single hitchhikers and bicyclists, as well as couples from Parisian society in designer clothes and designer Land Rovers, who had brought along designer meals from Dares back in Munich. The main street of Tam was lined with 2 rows of rough-and-ready restaurants, each with a few battered tables outside and inside, and surrounded by vendors selling chicken on rotisseries. Travelers gathered at these cafes and table-hopped, asking questions and gathering information in a swaggering yet egalitarian spirit. Parked out front like horses in the Old West were trail bikes, Japanese bikes, Toyotas, and Land Rovers festooned with sand ladders and bull catchers. Shovels were bolted on, and strapped on top were sleeping bags, camping equipment, and steel boxes of clothes. Every vehicle carried a plentiful number of green or gray jerry cans loaded with gas and water, as well as extra tires. The talk in the street cafes came to center on 3 topics: border officials, bribes, and the risks presented by crossing the Sahara. Due to breakdowns and the lack of fuel, dozens of Europeans and Africans died every year in the desert. A year before, a French family's Land Rover, off the main route, had broken down halfway to Arlit. For days, the mother had kept a diary of her husband's, and her 2 small children's battle against heat, hunger, thirst, and despair, as they waited in vain for help to come. Her diary ended with the faint scrawl of a plea for help, reflecting her and her family's fatal debilitation. A few months before, a caravan of 5 cars and 10 people had set out along the same route. As happens easily in the Sahara, where there are no roads but only the crudest of trails across hundreds of miles of rocks and dunes, they too had become lost. One car had broken down, and its occupants had piled into the other 4. One by one, 3 of the other cars broke down or ran out of gas, until the 10 travelers all rode in the last car. Then it broke down under the strain, and the 10 perished under the desert sun as they waited for help. Story after story like this made us sober about the dangers we faced. Obviously, we should stay on the main route at all costs, a feat we were told repeatedly wasn't easy because of the lack of a true road. In other conversations, the travelers identified for us and each other those border guards who would help, and those we had to bribe, and told horror stories about travelers caught with contraband. Desperate for hard currency, Algeria, like many African countries, had strict exchange controls, insisting that travelers exchange all their hard currency for the country's worthless dinars. No traveler could afford to change all his money 10 to 15 times as he passed through successive African countries. Not only would he lose money as the local currencies depreciated and as he paid the money changers' fees, but he wouldn't be able to exchange some currencies at all. Outside of Algeria, nobody wanted its dinars, and there were no banks at the southern end of the country. Thus, all travelers crossing the continent were forced to become smugglers. Finding this undeclared currency was an important source of revenue for the country. or for the border guards, who made big efforts to discover travelers' secret stashes. Frequently, in addition to confiscating the stash, they fined the smuggler 2 or 3 times as much as they found. All this led to much talk among Tam's Cafe Society about the best place to hide contraband, where on your person and where on your vehicle. The only thing Tabitha and I ever worried about hiding was money, because we didn't carry drugs or other contraband. I wore a money belt, which to my delight was never discovered by any border guard on our entire trip. One of our motorcycles had a mud-splattered manual underneath the seat in a filthy, dusty pocket. We hid money between its pages because it was too grubby to examine. In the frame under my gas tank, there was a hollow pipe into which we slipped money. The adventurousness of the travelers in Tam astonished us. We met 2 Amsterdam schoolteachers who had taken a year or 2 off to travel Africa. A New Zealander was making his way by ground back to New Zealand from London. There were 3 million people in New Zealand, he said, and 70,000 of them, or 2 to 3% of the population, were in the United Kingdom at any time. But traveling through Africa, I never saw any other Americans except for one missionary family. Tamanrasset was the last town on the paved road, so we had to check out with the Customs and Immigration Office. Here we had our passports, carnets, and currency declarations stamped for exit. Our mini caravan of 2 cycles and a truck pushed off into the Sahara proper. We asked our way out of town, as there were no signposts. Up to Tam, the roads had been good, 2-lane blacktop in fair repair. As we knew from the other travelers, however, from here on south, the road stopped and turned into a nightmare of sand. 31 miles out of town, the pavement indeed petered out, and we hit sand, hundreds of miles of it in every direction, just like in the movies. We dipped into a ravine and started a descent from 4,500 feet. Because the desert is flat and open, a traveler can make his route anywhere. The route we followed was a band of truck tracks, perhaps 2 miles wide. If a sandstorm had hit, the tracks would have been blown away, and we would have had to use compasses to navigate an empty sea of sand. For a quarter of an hour I suffocated on Tabitha's billowing cloud of dust and then called a huddle. Because of the dust, we would stretch out, Tabitha in front, me a half-mile or so behind and a quarter-mile to her right, and Pierre several miles farther back. The terrain became more desert-like the farther we moved into the Sahara. Dunes of sand and scrubby rock rose on both sides. The way was overblown with sand, threatening to throw us over and preventing any speed. Sometimes road markers, 55-gallon drums or tall poles stuck in the sand, showed us the way. Where the sand hadn't covered them, Tabitha followed tire tracks. She hoped whomever she was following knew where he was going, that we weren't following bandits, smugglers, or someone who himself was lost. As perhaps 50 tracks wove back and forth in front of her, she stuck to those more heavily traveled. Every 3 or 4 hours a truck, perhaps a mile or so distant, passed heading north, or one overtook us, heading our way but never getting close, making us again wonder if we were on the main route, if in fact there was such a thing. The trucks always made us feel better, that we were more or less in the right place, but shortly after they disappeared, doubt would creep back. The clusters of burned-out wrecks of cars we came upon made us feel better too, indicating we were probably on the main route. As spare parts were in great demand, these were completely stripped. As the lead vehicle, Tabitha drove slowly, working to pick the firmest surface across the ocean of sand. Despite her best efforts, however, she would become stuck in sand so deep it covered her tailpipe. Here was where teamwork was most important. I would get off my bike, put a board underneath its kickstand to keep it from falling over, and with her on the bike, push or dig the sand away from her wheels so she could inch forward. We carried a fold-up military shovel, but it wasn't particularly useful. Using my hands to scoop away the sand worked better. Once I'd removed it, however, Tabitha couldn't simply accelerate. She had to release the clutch slowly to prevent the wheel from spinning and digging her deeper into the loose sand. Yet she had to release it far enough so as not to burn up the clutch. Every time we smelled asbestos burning, it alarmed us. An extra couple of clutch plates weren't spare parts we had thought to pack. In one patch of sand, it took 3 hours to cover 15 miles. We were constantly getting stuck, constantly digging out, constantly pushing. Once Tabitha's bike was freed, I would walk forward several yards to find the best way to continue. Often we couldn't drive straight, as the loose sand ahead was even worse, and we would have to plot another path to the side. Sometimes we passed over a stony area sporting a patch or two of scrubby bush. Other times the sand became firm, and we hummed over it at 35 miles an hour. We had to be on the lookout for deep pockets of loose sand, traps that had wrecked the numerous stripped, burned cars along the way. The first day we covered only 75 miles, even though we were on the road for 10 hours. That night, exhausted yet feeling triumphant that our teamwork was mastering this ocean of sand, the three of us camped in the desert. We brewed tea and cooked on small butane stoves. There was no need to put up a tent, as here the terrain was as bare as the surface of Mars. It was not going to rain, the air was dry and cool, and there would be no dew. We didn't have to worry about animals or insects attacking us, as there was no wildlife for hundreds of miles, not a leaf, not a lizard, not an ant, not even a midge. The desert silence was so clean it was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Without life, the Sahara lacked the background chatter we normally experience. No bird chirped, no remote insect buzzed, no faraway airplane droned, no leaf rustled. I realized I'd never been in pure silence. It seemed a sacrilege, but I broke the silence by tuning in the BBC. The tension between the Allies and Iraq had increased again. We were glad to be putting miles between us and Arab Islamic culture. In the middle of the night, Tabitha and I both woke up, sure someone had turned the lights on. We jumped out of our sleeping bag and walked around. The canopy of stars was even clearer than in Alaska or Siberia. The full moon had come out, made exceptionally huge and bright by the desert atmosphere's lack of moisture, dust, and pollution. Nimble and vivid, our moon shadows followed us everywhere. We got out a book, and we were actually able to read by the extraordinary moonlight. The brazen moon, the deep quiet, the sensuous dunes. This exotic yet comforting nightscape brought Tabitha and I close to what was so wonderfully romantic that I think of it as one of the world's most perfect honeymoon spots, tough to get to as it is. The next day we rose early and pushed on. At the top of rises, the sand, blown away by the wind, wasn't so deep, but snowy drifts had been deposited in the dips, causing us to flounder. A couple of times when one of the bikes fell over, gas spilled from the tanks and carburetors. The desert was wrestling with us, trying to take charge. We encountered more stripped and abandoned cars, always near thick sand, often in clusters and on their sides or backs, victims of sand traps. Probably they had been traveling at high speed, hit a pocket of deep sand, and flipped over. I was reminded of old cartoons about the desert, showing bones around a waterhole, but here it was cars that hadn't made it. Navigating continued to be difficult. Any of the tracks might be the main trail, if such a thing existed. Any might lead into trackless wastes and death. At times, without a visible marker, the trails shot off in so many conflicting directions that the only way to navigate was by climbing on top of a wrecked car and peering southward to spot the next marker, or failing that, the next cluster of abandoned cars. We hoped these vehicular skeletons marked the next trail. We passed a Land Rover stuck in soft sand. Its passengers had put 2 10-foot sand ladders under its front wheels and were inching forward. They would repeat this till they were through the soft patch. Even though it was December, it was blazing hot, the sun roasting us an hour after sunrise. The white sand absorbed the sun's rays and reflected them back, throwing heat at us from above and below. In the middle of the day, we sweated profusely, especially when bogged down in sand. Afraid of spills, however, we continued to wear our leather jackets and chaps. A few times I sweated right through both my jeans and my chaps, something which, except for rugged days in Siberia, Hadn't happened before in all my 25 years of riding. Several days into the Sahara, I thought I saw my first mirage, a tandem bicycle ahead of us, carrying 2 people dressed completely in white. Amused, I watched and waited for this shimmering white image to disappear. As we clattered abreast of the mirage, the white-outfitted pair turned their heads, focusing on us black swimmer's goggles, aliens out of a feverish dream. I was so startled I flagged them down and asked, "God, what are you doing here? Where are you from?" They were a French couple on their honeymoon who had set out to bicycle across the Sahara. They were remarkably chipper and in good spirits. It had taken them 10 days to pedal across what so far had taken us 5 days. A few miles later, we came upon an Italian headed north whose motorcycle had broken down. We offered to take him back south to Arlit, but he refused, fearful of losing his bike to bandits or the desert. Our tanks were low, so we swapped him water for the gas he no longer needed. He hoped a truck would come along and give him and his motorcycle transportation north, but I had major doubts. Suppose this was one of the less frequented desert trails. Remembering the stories we'd heard in Tam about people never returning from the desert, I've often wondered if that Italian motorcyclist is still there, waiting for a truck. His stripped bike and skeleton, a grim reminder of the Sahara's unforgiving harshness. Finally, we hit the flat part of the desert near its southern rim. Small thorn trees told us there had to be water nearby. Tabitha was grinning madly as we moved along at 35 miles an hour, the dust in long, high coils behind us. She was delirious we'd made it across, shouting and waving. I felt good, too, relieved we hadn't been one of those who had died in this Martian landscape of beauty and death. This had been a tough part of the trip, days of sweaty effort, but we'd come through without undue mishap. As we barreled along, over and over I sang, "Oh, sea, sea rider, see what you have done. You've made me love you." When we stopped for water, still grinning, Tabitha said, "When I was in the 1st grade, I went ice skating one Sunday for the first time. I remember how I felt when I was able to skate across the whole pond by myself. I kept saying to myself, proud, proud, proud. That's how I feel today. Proud, proud, proud." Chapter 20. Sub-Saharan Africa. Everything changed as soon as we crossed from Algeria into Niger. We were coming out of North Africa, an Arabic Islamic culture, into Arlit, which, while still Islamic, was the first big city of Black Africa. As we crept south, the monotonous dunes turned into broken rocks, weeds, and scrub, the first growth we had seen in days. With only a few miles left to Arlit, we saw smoke. We passed a French-run uranium mine and an airstrip. The closer to Arlit, the better the road. The sand here was packed hard, and we made great time. We hit a 4-lane dirt road, doubtless here to provide access to the uranium mine. Arlit, another traveler's town, was a mixture of old and new, mud huts and modern houses. From time to time, topless, buxom women with goods on their heads and babies on their backs sauntered past the open butcher shops and vendors cooking meat and donuts on fires. We sat in a cafe and drank big brown bottles of African beer, impossible to order on the street back in a strict Islamic culture. A wave of relaxation spread over us as the paraffin lamps flickered in the dark and black faces smiled in our direction. After our jitters about being Americans in Arabic North Africa, it felt incredibly good to be here. Pierre had found a local girl whom he bragged was his for the price of a half bottle of whiskey and a pack of Marlboros. Like Tamanrasset, Arlit was a place to swap stories, get your vehicle repaired, and buy spare parts. We spent a day there, reconnoitering and pulling ourselves together. The next 150 miles south were over a well-paved road, we learned, an amenity that was created because the local uranium mine needed to ship out its ore, and that, as a byproduct, developed the general prosperity of this region. The town stayed open all night, its lamps gleaming a welcome as its principal occupation was serving foreign travelers. Tabitha didn't feel well. She had a fever, and over our first day here it got worse, making her woozier and woozier. She tossed and turned much of the next night. She took some aspirin and finally got a couple of hours' sleep. We decided to stop here another day to give her some rest. The evening was passed in several cheerful cafes where we drank cokes, sodas, and beer, and ate shish kebab and goat cheese. The next morning we drove to Zinder, 300 miles south. Tabitha felt worse, by now gulping aspirin and forcing down fluids. To give her more rest, we stopped a couple of days here, too. She still had a fever, which I was afraid was a result of heat stroke, perhaps from the Sahara, perhaps from walking around in the sun in Arlit. Entering Nigeria, we hit one of the worst border guards we'd ever encountered, a large fellow in a green uniform whose badge identified him as Lieutenant Ibrahim. "Well, you're American," he said in a snotty tone, "so I'm going to treat you the way I'd be treated at Kennedy Airport. I'm going to search you completely, because that's what you do to us at Kennedy." He was right, I thought. When the lieutenant saw we had BBC radios, he said, "Are you listening to it in Hausa?" the local language in which the BBC did indeed broadcast. As Nigeria had been an English colony, he spoke fine English. Staunching my impatience, I said, "No, we don't understand Hausa." He became indignant, because after all, he understood our language. He wanted to know which tribe we were. "We're not in any tribe." This made Lieutenant Ibrahim yet more overbearing. By oversight, I showed him the carnet that didn't have Nigeria stamped on it. He became furious that it didn't list his country. "We're the largest and strongest country in Africa," he ranted. "We're not a third world country. We're a world power, a rich world power. You'd better understand that." He checked every single document we'd thought to bring: the international certificates for the motorcycles, international driving permits, certificates of vaccination, entry visas, proof of ownership of photographic equipment, travel insurance forms, carnets, and passports. Seemingly disappointed at our preparedness, he and his men searched us completely, examining every item on our bikes. Fortunately, we didn't have to bribe them, although we left a carton of cigarettes on the counter, which promptly disappeared. He gave in. With a disgusted wave, he let us through. By now, we had begun to realize that guards like this Hausa would force us to budget an entire day for crossing each border, an extra 2 weeks to cross Africa alone. Tabitha was still feverish, still taking aspirin. As we moved on through Nigeria, we encountered one military checkpoint after another. Each one ate up long stretches of time. As the guards checked our papers and our bikes, I frequently questioned them. What was the point of these stupid inspections? Didn't they know they were driving away travelers, bringing much-needed hard currency into their economies? As Pierre hadn't had the foresight to obtain visas in North Africa, he wound up needing more money for bribes than he anticipated. I wound up forking over more for his expenses than I'd expected, but it seemed worth it to have the safety margin of extra supplies. Tabitha was still sick. I was sure it was just a little sun. I suggested she eat as much salt as she could and drink a lot of liquids, sodas, bottled water, whatever. Although she needed rest, we were afraid to stop in Nigeria because we were having so many problems with military checkpoints and visas. Despite her fever, we both wanted to get to Cameroon as fast as we could and put these checkpoint problems behind us. We hit a terrible section of dirt road for the last 5 miles of Nigeria, and it took quite a while to drive across it. Water had run over the road, which had then dried like a riverbed. The surface was hard, rutted mud, with potholes a foot or 2 deep. We had to pick our way across it. Even though we'd just been through the Sahara, Marwa seemed even hotter, even more suffocating. Here we found the first decent hotel we'd seen since Algiers. It even took credit cards, which was a help because we'd been burning up cash since Algeria. Its clean new rooms, air conditioning, swimming pool, with water in it, and modern bar made me a little giddy with disbelief. nor could we believe it had hot water until we took showers. To an American, it would have been the equivalent of a nice Holiday Inn in a small American city, but to us it was the Ritz. Despite the toll on Tabitha's health, we decided we had made the right decision in pushing through Nigeria. Tabitha had developed a cough, and the first night here it got worse. She took more aspirin, but the pain was so overwhelming that it didn't help. Whatever was in her chest had now gone into her ear, giving her a piercing earache. By now, this had continued on and off for 9 days, and she wasn't winning the battle. "I've got to get some help," she said. "This thing is getting worse." As it turned out, we were lucky. We had pushed on to the right spot. Next door was a private clinic run by a Chinese couple named Chang. I took Tabitha there. Dr. Chang wanted to run some blood tests, thinking she might have malaria. Having heard stories of used needles in African clinics transmitting AIDS, Tabitha was apprehensive. However, Dr. Chang had a drawer full of disposable needles, all nicely wrapped in sterile cellophane, so she accepted his care. This Chinese doctor not only had modern equipment, but a private room. It wasn't much more than a cement block cube with a bed, but it had an air conditioner and a bathroom. I brought fruit and sodas, held her hand and soothed her. She stayed in bed for 48 hours, right through Christmas Day. After hitting me up for a few extra bucks, Pierre found himself a cheaper hotel, where he entertained a different local girl every night. I mentioned the possibility of AIDS, but he laughed and brushed aside my warning. Dr. Chang diagnosed Tabitha's illness as a bronchial infection. He gave her a course of antibiotics. He was delighted to have our hard currency. I was amazed that the bill wasn't more. Just a couple of $100 for the antibiotics, the room, his care, everything. Marua turned out to be an interesting place, and I was glad we spent 9 days there resting. We became friendly with a shaggy blonde expatriate German called Dietrich Reinhardt, owner of an inn and a restaurant, with whom we spent several evenings. Back in the 70s, Dietrich had stumbled on a mode of making big money in Africa. He drove cars down from Europe and sold them at a profit. Over several years, he had made 20-odd trips, sometimes transporting 2 cars at once. For a while, he earned a large premium. Then other sellers piled in, which always happens in a market with a big profit. Once the premium was driven out of the business, it made no sense to continue. In their mid-30s, he and his wife now ran a restaurant, souvenir shop, bar, and inn. He also owned an auto repair business that catered to travelers. They had an easy life with 2 children and lots of servants. However, it was clear from discussions with them that their business was drying up. Travelers weren't coming through as they once had, nor were the automobile smugglers. During the late 80s, African travel had become more and more difficult. Currencies had deteriorated, restrictions grew more burdensome, and as African economies got into trouble, wars had spread and deterred tourists. These countries learned from the West only too well how to stick it to visitors. In the old days, you drove up to an African border and sailed right in, possibly leaving a tip of a carton of cigarettes or a bottle of whiskey. In those days, many travelers didn't have visas or the right papers. They might have been running from trouble in their own countries, or they might have been misfits starting their lives over. The Reinhardts loved their life, but things were getting tougher. Their kids were growing up. They didn't want to raise them here because Africa didn't look as promising as it had when they were in their 20s, back when the continent was an adventure. That was the problem with the life of an expatriate. Usually, an expat was dodging something. The Western expatriate in Africa was often a big fish in a small pond who did well because he didn't encounter much competition. Since the days of Lord Jim, expats have found they didn't have to run too fast. Now Reinhardt was looking for a way out. He was going to be in a terrible bind when he had to go back to Germany. Once Tabitha was back on her feet, we went out to a posh French restaurant near town for a bang-up meal. It was called Le Sarret. We had a wonderful meal, yet a sad experience. For 45 years, the French owner, Luc Philippe, now in his 80s, had maintained the equivalent of a first-class Parisian restaurant, complete with white liveried waiters with impeccable manners, French wine, and everything cooked to a fine French turn. Monsieur Philippe and his wife had brought everything from France, the culture, the manners, the dishes, the cutlery, and now the business was finished. The game hunters had stopped coming, and after the independence movement came, the tourists had slowed too. He had tried to entice his son into the business, but his son had gone to Hollywood to make movies. After his wife had died, he closed the restaurant for a while. Now it was back open and he was trying to sell it, but in a year or two it would be gone. Nobody was going to buy this white elephant of Parisian lavishness on the rim of the Sahara. Like many others, Monsieur Philippe was going to lose his life's work. Throughout this trip, we heard this story over and over. No matter what a person built, no matter how wonderful the house, the museum, the culture, the country, it was going to disappear. There was nothing permanent. We visited dozens of once powerful cities like Carthage that had been overrun and knocked apart, scores of once stately homes that were now in ruins. No matter how magnificent the castle, in 200, 500, 1,000 years, its ruins will be overgrown with vines. No matter how vast and powerful the empire, the country, the company, or the dynasty, it won't last. Monsieur Philippe would run his restaurant until he couldn't any longer, probably until he died, when it would be taken over by the state. The state would run it into the ground, because no Cameroon bureaucrat could manage it Monsieur Philippe's way. He had had some good years, and that was all there was, and all there could be. The papers here were full of the bloody revolt in nearby Chad. Marauding soldiers had broken into the national parks and zoos and machine-gunned the animals and eaten them. In Angola, the faction backed by the United States was having pitched battles with the dreaded communists. Zaire would break down into a bloody shooting match in a year now. So many conflicts remind me of barroom brawls on Saturday night, important to the drunken combatants, but rarely to anyone else. Despite these nearby troubles, I was optimistic about the future of Cameroon. The democracy movement here was beginning. The country had an educated, civilized population. In the 1990 World Cup, Cameroon got to the quarterfinals, the first African country to do so. At some point, this country, with its abundance of natural resources and an educated and outward-looking population, would be quite an investment. It would help a lot that the country was officially bilingual, speaking French and English, and that it was absorbing progressive information from not one, but two outside cultures. The population was not only aware of the outside world, but was encouraged to know about it. This was rarely true in dictatorships. At the right time, an investor could put his money into agriculture, metals, lumber, and food production. He should buy into any company that is well-financed and sells to its neighbors down south, such as South Africa and Botswana, or north into Europe. Cameroon was also small, which meant there weren't so many tribal factions. Borders here would probably not have to be redrawn, or at least not as extensively as those in the rest of Africa. Many borders in Africa were artificial, drawn by colonists going off into the woods on a horse and deciding where a country should begin and end. For example, Zambia had only 7.8 million people, but 25 different tribes. A glance at a map made you wonder how the country had been formed. There was no geographical or ethnic sense to its boundaries. They were just where Cecil Rhodes happened to go. In the same way that the USSR would split up and the borders in Eastern Europe would be redrawn until they made ethnic sense, here in Africa there would be upset until its borders were drawn in accord with natural geographic and ethnic divisions. Rested and well, we took off south. The roads weren't too bad, and we could make fair time. 1,000 miles later, stiff and sore, we pulled into Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, a former French colony, after an exhausting 12-hour day of driving. We had camped out the night before, so we were keen to get to civilization. We arrived after dark on New Year's Eve and checked into the Novotel. Dazed and weary, wanting a hot dinner, we went next door to Le Tropicana, which turned out to be a nightclub boisterous and stylish enough to have been located on Paris's left bank. A Western-style New Year's celebration was in full riot, including champagne, special French dishes, whistles, streamers, blowers, and oddball party hats. Our weariness miraculously fled after a couple of glasses of champagne. We stayed up till the small hours, dancing, trading party hats, and blowing whistles with the best of them. Like many third-world countries, the Central African Republic had prospered in the big commodities boom, but now had collapsed. Its buildings sagged, and poverty was everywhere. Like rats sensing a sinking ship, the savvy Indian and Arabian merchants who turned up in Africa, wherever there was prosperity, had sold their businesses and fled. The police hadn't been paid for 3 months. Walking to a restaurant at night, we often had to pay a bribe to those who stopped us to examine our passports. They called it a cadeau, a gift. $1 to $5 satisfied them. Had they insisted on more, they knew we might report them and get them into trouble. The CAR's biggest problem was its currency, yet the problem was the opposite of the one troubling so many other African currencies. It was too hard. Decades ago, the currency known as the CFA had been pegged to the French franc, which itself was now pegged to the Deutschmark. If the CAR could assign a value to its currency now, its government might peg the CFA at a fraction of this rate, but the CFA had been set when commodity prices were high. Changing the value of the currency now would be hard to accomplish, as all of Francophone Africa discovered when the CFA was devalued by 50% in early 1994. I suspect the problem is not yet solved completely. Since world commodity prices were denominated in dollars, the country had received a double whammy. As the dollar had declined 60% in value against the Deutschmark, the CAR was receiving that much less in value than 20 years before. On top of this, commodity prices had come down drastically, often by 50%. The hard truth was that the CAR now often received 20% of its former effective income for its products. To make matters worse, the CAR maintained large police and military forces, which produced nothing of economic value for the country. What an odd place. In a city with dirt streets and without phones were a number of fine French restaurants that served meals as exquisite as those in Paris and New York. Because of the absurd currency, the prices were the same as in Paris and New York, too. Here in January, we even drank fresh Beaujolais Nouveau. At Freddy's, the restaurant that became our favorite, I fell in love with Capitan lasagna, a dish made from a giant river fish that looked like a grouper. Afterward, we ate sherbet laced with vodka, which Freddy called kernels. We were in the depths of the third world, light years away from Marseille, the last place we'd had such meals, yet Cuban cigars and espresso topped off several sybaritic evenings. Bangui, named after the nearby rapids of the Ubangi River, was being flooded with immigrants from the countryside come to town for jobs. Its modern blocks and broad avenues were shaded by mango trees and scarlet-flowered flamboyants, while its central market bustled with commerce. The black part of town, called Kilomètre 5, was fabulous, its nightlife justly famous for its wildness. Bars, restaurants, and discos were full of every kind of exuberant activity. We went out on New Year's Day. The town was booming, nightlife throbbing at noon. Pierre had a field day, squiring a succession of comely African girls to the honky-tonks. He hit me up for an increase in his rates, which I wouldn't give him, but then he wheedled an advance out of me. In visiting government offices to obtain permits and visas, I came to the conclusion that the Central African Republic was still a French colony, albeit a secret one. For every black administrator, there was a Frenchman in the next office or at the next desk, to whom many matters were referred. French officers were advisors, the same word used in the Kennedy years for our military in Vietnam. I immediately noticed the contrast with former British colonies. French influence was everywhere, much more evident than the British in their former colonies, which had made a cleaner break. Even the CAR's president's chief of staff was a Frenchman, as was the commander of the Presidential Guard. The French gave French school teachers bonuses and tax breaks to come out here to teach. Several times Giscard d'Estaing, president of France, had come to hunt with Jean Bedel Bokassa, the former emperor, who had made him gifts of diamonds. That had caused a scandal back in Paris, where they didn't seem to value the true nature of post-colonial African politics. We rode by a set of buildings that looked like a public housing slum. The windows were broken, bricks were falling out, and the lawns were unattended. My new African friend Jean said, "That's the university." "How long has it been there?" I asked. "About 20 years," he answered. I was amazed. The French government had built it as part of their foreign aid. Whether it was Peace Corps aid or the heritage of the European colonialists, everywhere we turned in Africa, the waste of the West legacy was appalling. We then passed a stadium, 10 years old and crumbling from lack of maintenance. Some European agency had come in and said, "What you need here is a soccer stadium." It gave them one, and 10 years later it was falling apart. Here we had to make a decision, one we had been wrestling with for days. Two routes presented themselves, neither attractive. Should we now drive through Zaire, a rainforest a quarter of the size of the United States, across what we had come to hear were the world's worst roads, or should we push through Angola, in the midst of a fierce civil war? Bangui was like Tam and Arlit, a traveler's crossroads. Tabitha and I pored over maps and consulted every traveler for news. "It would have been tough," said Walter, a traveler coming west, "but you might have made it over Zaire's roads if you'd been here a few weeks ago, in the drier season. It's too close to the rainy season now. Even the best jungle roads turn into mud gullies." I thought of Isaac Dinesen, who had lived in Kenya only a few miles from the capital. Kenya didn't have near the rain Zaire had, yet in Out of Africa, she wrote that during the rainy season, she wasn't able to travel even into town. The map said the roads were better in Angola, but we couldn't be sure. Because of the war, no travelers came through there. The fighting had died down, but any day it might flare up. On the other hand, Zaire wasn't at war, but due to the rainy season, its roads would shortly become officially closed, and there would likely be no gas along them. The rains would become so steady we might be stuck for weeks or months in a village hundreds of miles from any city, ruining our chances of crossing Tierra del Fuego or the Andes before the South American winter locked up travelers. Weighing the considerations, we decided to go through Angola. Better a danger that was abating, the BBC's shortwave broadcast confirmed the war had cooled, than a known hazard. To motorcyclists who had wrestled with the dunes of the Sahara, Africa's passable roads, and Siberia's dirt highways, a war zone seemed preferable to hundreds of miles of mud wallows that the locals called roads. Back in New York, Eunice, who ran my office, had decided to retire. She had hired a young man named Judd as her replacement. He was a whiz on a computer, she said. Enterprising and efficient, he obtained permission from the consulate in New York for us to go through Angola and sent it to us via express courier. I was relieved that we had such a firm anchor back home. Having made this decision, we now faced the problem of getting to Angola. There was no road from Bangui to Brazzaville and Kinshasa, our twin city jumping-off point. The only way to get to Brazzaville with our 3 vehicles, said the French consul, was to take a barge down the Congo and cross to Kinshasa, the westernmost city of Zaire. From there, we could drive south into Angola. "Remember," he said, "there's no people and no food on the barge. Buy everything you need in advance." "Come on," I said to Tabitha and Pierre. "Let's go see this barge." Chapter 21. Down a Lazy River. The barge was as long as a football field, rusty and beaten up, with stacks of logs and freight containers in its center, and crowds of travelers around its deck. It teemed with people, naturally all black Africans. It would chug down the Ubangi River, which fed into the Congo, the river that swallows all rivers, as the Zairians put it. The trip would take 8 days because the rains hadn't yet come. I was excited. A trip down the Congo through the jungle. We'd have to rough it on the deck in sleeping bags and tents. Not only would it be an adventure, but it was the only way south. Late in January, we loaded our motorcycles and the pickup truck onto the barge and pitched our tents on the back deck. On schedule, a tug came along and collected us. We were on one of 4 similar barges lashed together, a floating village containing hundreds of people pushed downstream by the tug. Business was being done on every side at makeshift tables displaying bread, medicines, nets, salt, and soap. The aisles were jammed with people shouting and haggling even over items as cheap as a box of matches. I was offered catfish, eel, and a strange bottom fish with large lips and tentacle-like feelers. Farmers, fishermen, and their families were taking their fish and produce downriver to the great market in Brazzaville. They not only smoked the meats and ground the grain into flour as we sailed downstream, they sold their products in villages along the way. A live 7-foot crocodile tied to a pole was stuck under one table, his furious eye glaring as if he would show us a thing or two if he could only escape the ropes binding him. Hunters and fishermen pulled up next to the barge in pirogues and offered pigs, antelope, bananas, and fish to merchants standing at the rail next to us. Whenever we stopped, villagers crowded on board to sell turtles, lizards, pigs, snakes, and even baskets of caterpillars. Slaughtered and alive, ground, cured, and smoked, the harvest of the jungle and the river was gliding down the great waterway to Brazzaville. For breakfast, our fellow passengers had bread and tea. Often in the late afternoon, they ate a bowl of manioc and beans on manioc greens. We never developed a taste for ground manioc, a root vegetable that grew wild, which reminded us of chewy dough. Smoked crocodile, however, was light and tender and surprisingly like chicken. Sometimes we were invited to share our neighbors' meals of palm grubs, plantains, caterpillars, and roast monkey. We decided that the barge's "no food and no people," referred to by the French consul, meant no Western food or people. For the first time on the trip, Tabitha could set up housekeeping and a rudimentary kitchen. In addition to meals made from ingredients all around us, we had the European food bought before we'd left. We ate sumptuously. To our right lay the Congo, the former French Congo, and to our left, Zaire, the former Belgian Congo. We were chugging through one of the most fertile regions on the planet, which some scientists call the lungs of the earth. 100 inches of rain fell here every year. Heated by the roaring tropical sun and dumped into the Congo basin's nearly 2 million square miles, this rain erupted into thousands of forms of life. The shore beyond our rail teemed with hundreds of species of trees, more than 1,000 varieties of flowers, scores of different mammals, and hundreds of types of birds, reptiles, and amphibians. The barge itself teemed with life. As usual, Pierre made himself available to the local demoiselle, hopping from barge to barge, always quick with debonair compliments, Western cigarettes, and trinkets for youthful ears, necks, and wrists. On every side of us unfolded the drama of birth, death, mating, deals, squabbles, and reconciliations. Living so close to our shipmates, we came to know all their habits, as they did ours. At night, we zipped ourselves into our mosquito-proof tent and carefully killed every mosquito. In the morning, we were usually awakened by the whine of a few more, they having somehow infiltrated the tent's defenses. Whenever we stopped, the fellow with the goats went ashore to gather leaves and branches for his herd. A barnyard odor hovered over parts of this floating village. The official latrine was in the back of the tug, from which naturally our wastes dropped into the river. Near the latrine stood 2 river water showers, available for everyone. Queues formed in the morning and the evening. Tabitha and I showered in the middle of the day, when there wasn't much of a line. The shower's water couldn't be turned off and on, as the tug's motors continuously pumped up water from the river. Since there was no separate changing room, we had to undress inside the stall without getting our clothes wet. Not easy. The river water was cooling, but still warm. After the shower, with the water still raining next to us, we had to dry off and dress without getting wet again. Our barge was not only a floating village, it was also a floating shopping center. From time to time, we pulled abreast of villages. Housewives crowded up our gangplank to buy salt, soap, and other household necessities. Traders left the barges and went into the villages to buy fish and game. These villages were sometimes a collection of thatched huts standing on poles over the river, at other times mud huts with thatched roofs. Most had yards that were swept daily, on which no grass or twigs grew, which reminded me of the yards of many black people back in Alabama. I wondered if sweeping yards clean of vegetation was a bit of cultural heritage that had survived the migration west in slave times. Clotheslines held the wash, and pirogues were pulled up amid the roots of the jungle's towering trees. Children dashed about while the men, often in blue jeans and tank tops, pushed their pirogues through the lagoon-like waters. Whenever we hit one of these quiet villages, Tabitha and I went for a walk. Frequently we came across a lone Arab in traditional garb in the village's only merchant stall. He would seem out of place in the jungle, a single turbaned merchant in a village of 600 Congolese. I figured these Arabs to be expatriates like Reinhardt, able to thrive where there was less competition. In one village, a white guy drove by in a beat-up Land Rover. About 4 minutes later, he roared back and asked in French, "Who the hell are you?" Jean, with his wife Angelique, had left Paris 3 years before to develop a logging business. The Congo was trying to bring in entrepreneurs again. He'd been sent by a French logging company to ship out mahogany and other exotic woods. Intelligent, quick, urbane, and sophisticated, he seemed the wrong sort to be living in the heart of darkness. By now, we'd been on the barge for days without a good wash. Our new friend invited us to his house for hot showers, which sounded like hog heaven to us. We drove by a building that I thought was a school. "No," said Jean. "It's a match factory. It's fully staffed, but it hasn't produced a match in years." I asked, "The workers don't do anything?" "They go in to work and sit," he said. 6 employees and a boss, 7 of them. 20 years before, the North Koreans, for whatever political reason, had decided to make a gift of a match factory to the Congo. The country had nothing if not wood, so I supposed it kind of made sense. Unfortunately, as with almost all statist endeavors into commerce, the factory turned out to be inefficient and non-competitive. The state couldn't sell the matches, partly because the Congo, too, was tied to the overpriced CFA, Central African franc, and partly because nobody here knew how to make matches. This was a national enterprise, however, so the government wouldn't fire these workers. I remembered that the Congo National Airline had only 2 planes and more than 400 workers, a similar statist boondoggle. Every day, these 7 people came to work in the match factory, did nothing, took vacations for 2 weeks of the year, and returned to do more nothing. They hadn't made a match in 20 years. We left Bangui as 4 barges pushed by a tug. By the time we joined the Congo River, we had become 7 barges. The Congo River. At 10 billion gallons moving past each second, it was the world's second most powerful river after the Amazon, and a transportation system of more than 8,500 miles of navigable waterways. Joseph Conrad called it an immense snake uncoiled, with its head in the sea and its tail lost in the depths of the land. A larger tug took over. Captain Joseph served as captain, mayor, and judge over what was now a floating town. At one point, when a local cop tried to shake us down for the usual cadeau, Captain Joseph stepped in and sent the fellow packing. He was happy to store our beer in his refrigerator, and several times we had a drink with him. This wasn't just a boat, he informed us with a grave smile, but a social service. This part of the world, with no roads and few boats, depended on his barge service. "I am this region's only market," he explained, his ebony face shiny with pride. "Its only pharmacy, clinic, and bar for a couple of 100 miles. I bring the town to the people." The view from the captain's bridge showed how right he was. We were now 11 barges, crammed with more than 1,000 people. Smoke rose in a haze across the decks from cook stoves and braziers. Masses of passengers filled every passageway and aisle. Some women nursed babies and yelled at children, while others washed clothes and sang. Men played cards and shot dice. Here and there, the odd barber cut hair. Over the back rail of one of the barges, a bearded man was butchering a monkey. As we moved downstream, commerce became more diverse. Now traders' tables displayed unwrapped bars of brown soap, cellophane bags of crackers, loaves of bread, bags of rice, and perhaps underneath a smoked antelope. A witch's table contained vials, potions, amulets, feathers, and charms of all sorts, along with a dried gorilla's hand that was supposed to give its owner particularly powerful magic. Yet other tables sold mosquito coils, tetracycline, malaria pills, vials of penicillin powder, hypodermic needles, and piles of brightly colored capsules. One table held big porcelain and tin bowls of roasted caterpillars and palm grubs, which seemed to have the appeal of potato chips and French fries for the passengers. Finally, we were 13 barges, all still pushed by the single tug lashed in the middle of the 4 rearmost barges. More barges gave Pierre a wider field through which to roam, allowing him to pick off a different Congo lass on every deck, sometimes several in a day. One day, as we were chugging along, the deck shuddered underneath. There was a loud thud, and Tabitha and I were thrown to the side. Around us, everyone lost his balance. Soap and salt containers shot off the makeshift tables. We rushed to the rail. This was the tail end of the drier part of the year, on the cusp of the rainy season. The water was low. We'd gone aground on a hidden sandbar. At the front of the barges, Captain Joseph shoved the tugboat in reverse to push us off. The tug pushed and pulled for a quarter of an hour without any success. We were stuck. With some unease, we watched the captain's roustabouts unlash the tugboat from its surrounding network of barges. The tug maneuvered away into the river. I was worried. Was he leaving for help? Suppose the barges floated away. Maybe he knew what he was doing. Maybe he didn't. How much training did a Congo River pilot get? From his position in the middle of the river, Captain Joseph fired up the diesel motors of his tug. He rushed toward us as if to ram us, which he did. No gentle nudge either, but a hard blow. It worked, however, knocking the leftmost barge loose from the sandbar. Now our 13 barges, all strapped together, were gliding down the mighty Congo without guidance. With another belch of smoke from the tug, the captain revved up his engine and raced toward the rear of the barges. If he weren't skillful enough to navigate the current, manipulate into position, and hook the tug back up, our 13 barges would float downstream and crash into the bank, one into the other, a real mess and a real danger. But the captain knew what he was doing. He skillfully maneuvered into position and hooked up again, and we proceeded downriver. Finally, we reached the end of the line, Brazzaville. 13 days of life on a floating African village. The merchants on board piled off and in jig time set up a marketplace on the dock. Like Americans meeting transatlantic supply ships in colonial times, thousands of urban dwellers streamed down and bought fresh supplies. In a day, everything would be purchased. Brazzaville, the Congo's southernmost city and capital, was more developed than Bangui. It had been Charles de Gaulle's headquarters back when the Free French were headquartered here in the Second World War. On the side of a warehouse was a huge picture of Lenin, hand lifted over his head as he led the workers forward, which momentarily made me think I was back in Russia and struck me with culture shock. I remembered that the Congo had gone completely communist at one point, one of the 2 or 3 countries in Africa that had totally bought Lenin's philosophy back in the 70s, when it was all the rage in the Third World. Outside Brazzaville, we visited the world's first orphanage for gorillas. Its 20 orphans had been brought in by rangers, who by law were now able to confiscate any gorilla offered for sale. The orphanage was funded by a British conservationist, John Aspinall, who owned 2 wild animal parks in England. So far, he'd spent $1.5 million to build and maintain the orphanage, and he planned to spend another $1 million building yet more facilities. This park would also become a center for the study of primates, whose numbers were steadily declining. Many of these orphans had seen their mothers slaughtered by hunters, and their teacher, Henry, told us they were often as wounded by the experience as a 3-year-old child would be. These baby gorillas needed 24-hour monitoring. Henry, an English zoologist in his early 30s, explained that gorilla mothers didn't wean their young for a year and often kept them by their side until they were 3 or 4. Like a room full of 6-year-old humans, each orphan had its own personality and antics with which to gain attention. Henry told us that research on chimps had shown them to be 99% genetically related to humans. Watching these gorilla orphans, I could believe that they were closely related to us. One slapped me on the bottom and ran off, only to do it again when I wasn't looking. Several were shy. Some were playful and others show-offs. They interacted so strongly with us, it was almost as if they were talking to us, letting us know their personalities, unlike, say, a room full of cats, which wouldn't let us know what they were thinking. The goal of the 20-acre camp was to prepare these orphans for life back in the jungle. Henry assured us that despite their camp existence, they retained their instinctive ability to learn jungle ways. I remembered that dried gorilla hand back on the barge. I shuddered as I wondered if one of these orphans' hands would wind up for sale on a witch's table. One 2-year-old climbed all over me, making something of a pest of himself. Henry scolded him and he pulled away, patting me on the back to make sure I wasn't offended. Chapter 22. Home of the Always Victorious Warrior. Kinshasa, Zaire's capital city, was the first major city we'd been in since Algiers, but nothing seemed to work. Upper-class Zairians walked around with walkie-talkies and mobile phones because their hardwired phones were useless. At the hotel, many prices were in United States dollars. Those in the local currency, the Zaire, were raised daily, even the prices of newspapers. Restaurants didn't list prices on the menu. They inserted a new price list with every meal. 2 days before we were to set out, a BBC shortwave broadcast informed us that intense fighting had broken out along the route we planned to take through Angola. We struggled again with our decision: drive through Angola or Zaire. What a choice. An active war or a trek along roads that by every account were far worse than Siberia's. Even the main road that went south to Lubumbashi, capital of the southern region and through which we had to pass, was described as a river of mud. At the American Embassy, we explored our options with an officer, Phil Cohen. We asked what was going on in Angola just down the road. Knowing that UNITA, the combatants the U.S. favored, were being supervised from this embassy, we knew he wasn't allowed to say much. "Just tell us what to avoid," I said, having come to understand how much embassy officials hated to see citizens from their countries. "Don't tell us any secrets." Embassy personnel had wonderful jobs at good pay in fabulous locales. They were honored in the exotic countries in which they were posted. But then in came their bedraggled citizens with problems, requests, complaints, and grievances, spoiling a perfect succession of perfect days. Even though Angola was only a few miles away, he airily waved his hand and said, "I have no idea." He promised to call a friend at the political section to see what he could find out. When we came back the next day, however, Phil was cooler, downright icy. "Nobody here knows anything about Angola," he said with a straight face. "But don't go there." I gathered this meant he wouldn't go out on a limb with information that might get us hurt, or that he and the political section thought we might be spies. We were on our own. Over the next 24 hours, the BBC reported that the heat-up of the Angolan War was increasing, but I still resisted driving through 1,500 miles of jungle mud to Lubumbashi. Everybody who had ever been through Zaire had horror stories to tell, and I wasn't eager to supply more. On the other hand, even if the Angolan roads were better, I didn't want to be shot or taken hostage. Every traveler warned us of Angolan landmines. More one-legged people were said to live there than any other place in the world. Each time Zaire seemed more attractive, I shuddered. It was the model of the post-colonial disintegration of African nations. The second largest country in sub-Saharan Africa, Zaire was the size of California, Texas, and Alaska combined. Potentially it was rich, with large deposits of cobalt, copper, diamonds, tin, manganese, zinc, silver, cadmium, gold, and tungsten. Coffee, rubber, palm trees, cocoa, and tea grew easily there. Its vast system of inland waterways provided access to the interior and was the foundation for a major part of the hydroelectric potential of Africa. Despite all this, its per capita income was one of the lowest in Africa. For years, its economy had hovered on the brink of disaster because of corruption, depressed prices for major exports, massive foreign indebtedness, capital flight, and inflation. In short, it was a potential economic giant, reduced to one of the world's 10 poorest countries. The currency rate was 3,000 zaires to the dollar and depreciating daily. Zairians went to the bank every day to check the rates. As I write this, the rate is several million zaires to the dollar, up from 700,000 a few months ago. This is hyperinflation, usually a last step before political, economic, and social collapse. Besides the fall-off in commodities prices, Zaire and many African regimes were disintegrating because the Americans and the Russians were no longer propping up the thugs running them. Back in the Cold War, the two superpowers had spent tens of billions of dollars currying favor on this continent. Like many African dictators, Mobutu, Zaire's dictator, had played both sides against the middle until he realized his diamond, copper, and cobalt mines were more valuable to us than to the Russians. He now had become so afraid of his own people that he spent most of his time on a barge in the Congo River, protected from them. President Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngabindu Wazabanga, which meant the always victorious warrior who is to be feared, was one of the richest men in the world, his personal fortune estimated at $6 billion to $8 billion. He had ruled for 26 years. We heard nothing about him but stories of his corruption, thievery, and abuse of his native land. When he moved around the country, he was surrounded by secret police and accompanied by suitcases full of money. Everywhere he doled out zaires to his subjects to curry goodwill. All enterprises of any economic importance had been nationalized. In other words, Mobutu had stolen every decent business. As the government, he had spent no money on the country's infrastructure, except to pave a road through the village in which his family lived and to prop up the national airline. Even the greediest colonialist would not have treated his plantation in such a sorry fashion. He had forced the country to spend more on him than it did on its schools, hospitals, roads, and social services combined. During his years of rule, he had built 11 lavish palaces. He owned a 16th-century castle in Spain, a posh townhouse in Paris, a 32-room mansion in Switzerland, and 23 other estates around Europe. According to the New York Times, he spent $5,000 every couple of weeks to have his hair cut by a barber flown in from New York. He wasn't the only corrupt official in Africa, but he was the continent's worst. In Togo, General Ignace Eyadema, its military dictator, had billions stashed in foreign bank accounts. The list of guys who got rich as African dictators in the past 35 years is endless. The Western press disclosed that Nigeria, its national treasury systematically looted over the years by thousands of government officials, was poorer by more than $30 billion, which had been socked away in Switzerland. 6 Nigerians were reported to be billionaires, 6,000 were multimillionaires, and 55,000 were millionaires, while 22 million Nigerians earned less than 10 naira, or $1.50 a day. The United Nations reported that 40% of all children under age 5 in Africa suffered malnutrition so severe it caused mental or physical damage. Estimates of what greedy African rulers had taken out of the continent ranged well over $100 billion, nearly all of it from foreign aid, enough to have established an infrastructure that would have staved off immense suffering by tens of millions of people. So much for these assorted socialists, communists, and fathers of their countries. The tiny elite who ran Zaire cruised the decrepit roads in new Mercedes-Benzes. To them, the rest of the country hardly existed. They shopped and educated their children in Europe. For the rest of Zaire's 35 million people, life was very hard. The railroads, built back during colonial times, ran infrequently because of a lack of fuel. Most of the roads had fallen into ruin. Schools had no books and paper and few capable teachers. There was very little equipment, labs, or drugs in the hospitals. Commerce had come to a virtual standstill. Zairians along the Congo River were lucky that they could still trade. We passed falling down barns, houses, and water towers, and large inland rubber and cotton plantations turning back into jungle. What little rubber and cotton that was raised often went unharvested because trucks could no longer reach the villages. No one dared to dream of a better life. Zairians knew they had a rich country and that the elite had stolen everything from them. They suffered and saw all their neighbors suffering. They knew damn well they were a good people trapped in a terrible system. We saw this reflected in the street. There were dealers for Mercedes-Benz and BMW cars, but none for motorcycles and bicycles, the poor man's efficient means of transportation, nor for inexpensive cars like Toyotas and Fiats. The fighting intensified in Angola. It was drive through Zaire or fly to South Africa, but that would violate the spirit of my dream. We would drive. We set out south for Lubumbashi, our first stop, Kikwit. To our relief, the road wasn't bad, mostly hard-packed earth. The first day we made 300 miles. Not too happy to leave behind the pleasures of civilization, Pierre followed along. As the slow, clumsy truck held Tabitha and me back, we sometimes pushed on ahead. Having taken a wrong turn and left the main highway, we came across a village of pygmies, which we discovered were the underclass of Africa, regarded as uncivilized. About 4.5 to 5 feet high, they were perfectly proportioned. Shorter than average myself, I felt an affinity for these small folks. For once I was a giant, towering over other adults. As a souvenir, I bought a pygmy crossbow. Although in towns a few blacks had pygmy servants, for the most part these people lived in the jungle without clothes, not migrating to the cities like other tribes. Why go to a city and be subjugated? I was surprised to find gas was only $2.50 a gallon. I couldn't figure out if the government sold it cheap to keep people happy, or if the currency had collapsed too fast for the price to be raised to keep up with it. "Come on, Jim," Pierre begged in the village of Mukoko. "You have money. Give me a little for tonight." "No, I've given you all I said I would," I answered. "No more." From the way he ground his boot heel in the dust, I thought he was going to say more, but he spun away. I was sick and tired of his wheedling more and more money out of me. I figured I was playing some role from his Parisian childhood, a remnant of unfinished business with his father. Well, this was the real world, not the Paris of his pampered youth. Sullenly, he agreed to meet us at the Catholic mission in Mapangu. All day, Tabitha and I sweated along Zaire's main highway, little more than a pair of deep mud ruts. At sunset, we stopped, worn out, at the compound of the Mapangu mission. No hotel. We considered ourselves lucky to find hospitable missionaries. Monsignor Francis allowed us to use the guest house to the right of the main building. With a number of empty rooms, this was a low, square building, nearly surrounded by a wide, covered porch whose roof was supported by arches and columns. Unlike in many other missions, only Africans were present. We'd had a hard day on the road, but Pierre had had an even harder time. He arrived 2 hours after us, having been stuck in mud for several hours. He was exhausted, sweaty, and covered with dirt. Soon after he arrived, he confronted me, again demanding money. I refused. Hell, I didn't owe him a nickel. I'm told that one of the many fatal flaws in my character is that when anyone pushes me, I push back. Back home in Alabama, we were brought up properly and played by the rules. I never had any reason to push anybody. But once I moved to New York, I met people who broke the rules, and I've become far more assertive. I suppose there's more to it than that. There's an anger in me I've seen in my parents, siblings, and grandparents too. All these smart, spunky people who kept missing opportunities and ending up with little. My grandmother Gladys was a wire service reporter in Hugo, Oklahoma during the 1940s and 1950s. She'd been a maverick in that macho frontier society, a tiny little lady, no more than 5'1", who was always marching down to the sheriff's office to interview murderers. But she'd married a man called Dutch, who'd reached his peak when he was student government president and captain of his college football team. By the time I knew them, their years of early promise had become no more than faded memories, and both knew it. Grandmam, as I called Gladys, had missed all her best chances. She understood life had much more to offer than she'd ever gotten or would get. There was a frustration in her, a fury, that I'd seen even as a boy. Much as I loved her, I didn't want to end up like that. That's another reason I don't like it much when people try to take away what's mine. So, I refused to give Pierre any more money than I'd promised, knowing it would never stop once I gave in. We stood on the driveway, with people from the mission all around us. He kept demanding money, drawing closer, but I kept refusing. He got mad enough to throw a punch, making me stagger backward. He was a lot bigger and stronger than me. Several of the natives pushed us apart. They talked me into walking away. Rattled and angry, I left Pierre to camp out on the front porch, where I went around to the opposite side of the building, where Tabitha and I had been given a room. Hyped up by what to do about Pierre, I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I experienced my first all-out tropical rainstorm, with thunder loud enough to knock you out of bed. The rain caused so much flooding that the ground eroded from under Tabitha's bike, toppling it. I had to go out in the middle of the night and wrestle the two 500-pound bikes up onto the porch outside our bedroom door. The storm continued until almost dawn. I'd hoped to drive away before Pierre woke up, leaving him here to fend for himself. No such luck. He hadn't slept either. First thing in the morning, Tabitha and I went around to the front of the building where we'd left most of our gear. 10 or 15 other people, all Africans, were gathered there, gabbing in French with Pierre. He came up and asked, "When are we leaving?" He looked even more exhausted than the night before. "I don't know what you're doing," I replied. "We're going on, but you're not coming with us." As I packed, he mulled that over. Then he reached into his backpack and took out his Bowie knife. I'd seen it many times before, but now it frightened me. Knife in hand, he slunk toward the rear of the mission. I instantly knew he was going for the bikes, our only way out of here. Instead of following, I raced around the building in the opposite direction. By the time I turned the last corner, Pierre was already leaning over my BMW. He seemed to be looking for something to slash, maybe the tires, maybe the fuel line. You can't stab an engine, but there's a hell of a lot of other damage you can do. He looked like he was going to demolish my motorcycle. As loud as I could, I shrieked, "Get the hell away from that bike!" Pierre looked up, startled. Then he came after me, knife raised. "Jimmy, I kill you!" he shouted. As I ran away from Pierre and his knife, splashing wildly through mud and puddles, I couldn't help thinking he was calling me Jimmy just to piss me off, because he knew I didn't particularly like it. It was sure working. When your life is at risk, you think fast. I didn't want to fight him, not with that knife of his. I did want to lure him away from the bikes, and I figured the jogger in me ought to outrun him, even though he was 25 years younger. He smoked cigarettes, and I'd never seen him do a lick of exercise. So I ran full tilt toward the front of the building, hoping to beat him there. I prayed that somehow those other people would save me. While I ran, I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure he was following and not going back to the bikes. I kept screaming, too, in English, "Help me! He's got a knife!" Pretty dumb, since everybody in Zaire spoke French. They may not have understood my words, but the men hanging out in front of the mission realized something was wrong. By the time I was halfway around the building, 4 or 5 of them were running toward me. I ran right past them and kept running until I saw them stop Pierre. I'm not sure how they did it. The men had him outnumbered and more people soon joined them. Somehow they calmed him down and got his knife. They took him inside the building and sent for the police. To my satisfaction, the police were soon there. I told the ranking cop, a captain, the full story. He asked Pierre for his side of things, which came out as my refusing to pay him his wages. I'd brought him this far into the jungle as his employer, he said, and now I ought to put up the money for his passage back to Paris. That wasn't the deal. He had tried to kill me, I explained, and I wanted him held. We wanted to go south, and we didn't want him following us. As far as we were concerned, he could be released in a couple of days. The captain's smooth, dignified face was troubled, as if a dispute between unruly foreigners wasn't something he knew how to handle. About 6 feet tall and with a bushy mustache, he weighed a couple 100 pounds. Yet even with the crowd of spectators milling around and yelling, he was calm and unflappable, as if he often adjudicated disputes in the midst of commotion. "Do you want me to arrest him?" the captain asked me in French. As I have only a nodding acquaintance with the language, Tabitha translated. "You're damn right," I said. "He tried to kill me. Ask any of these people." "All right." He gave orders to his men who moved near Pierre. He said to me, "You'll have to pay 200,000 zaires." I was flabbergasted. "Pay? What for?" He shrugged. "There are many costs involved. May I see your passports?" "Of course," I said. "Everything's in order. We have visas too, everything." He scanned them and stuck them in his pocket. "I think we'd all better go back to town together until this is sorted out," he said. This meant going 70 miles onto Ilebo, a good-sized regional town with a military garrison, which at least was in our direction. Hating any delay, I argued we had to be on our way, that we had a schedule to meet. But even in my fervor, I realized that the bubble of the Antarctic winter looming at the southern tip of South America argument was not going to be a persuasive one here at the African equator. Ilebo had one main drag, dirt, of course, or rather mud. In the center of town stood a police stand, one of those overturned garbage cans policemen stand on in direct traffic, but no one had used it in years. We got the best room in the town's main hotel, the Hotel du Palme, which the colonists had built for a visit from the King of Belgium in the early 1920s. The richly paneled rooms were gigantic and surrounded by large open terraces. The huge bathrooms sported fixtures from the 20s. Downstairs was a dining room, but it served virtually nothing. "Sir," asked the houseman in stiff English, "how many buckets of water do you want?" A bit startled, I asked Tabitha how many. We settled on 2. We soon found out why we had been asked. While our bathroom had in fact been the king's, it no longer had running water. To wash, take a bath, or flush the toilet, we had to use river water from the dozens of buckets we finally had lined up across the tile. The Palm had its advantages, though. It cost only $1 a night. As in the Soviet Union, the rates had been set a long time before and hadn't been adjusted during the collapse of the currency. The first order of business was getting out of there. We hot-footed it over to the captain's command post. The captain's position was that we had to pay for all the trouble we'd caused, for all the expenses we'd run up, and that 200,000 zaires would cover it. "What expenses?" I asked. Tabitha translated. We had to pay for Pierre to be in jail, pay to feed him, and pay to guard him. I could pay in zaires, although he would rather have dollars. He was no dummy. His country's currency was collapsing at the rate of 1% or 2% a day. I asked for our passports back. He said they would be safer with him. Whenever I asked him his name, he changed the subject or ignored me. I asked to call the American embassy in Kinshasa. The captain's face lit up. What a wonderful idea. He himself would take us to the town's telephone. I would get the ambassador on the blower and insist he get someone down here to straighten out this mess. With the captain at my side, I marched triumphantly through the sun to the town's single phone, located in the community center, a compound with a swimming pool, basketball court, and bar, none of which was open. The captain picked up the instrument and fiddled with it. "It's not working," he said with an apologetic shrug and a smug smile. Back at the Palm, I gave the problem more thought. I rummaged in my saddlebags for a pen and stationery. I ambled over to the post office, little more than a 20 by 20-foot shed. I stuck my head into the clerk's cubbyhole and handed him a letter to the United States Embassy in Kinshasa, a few hundred miles back north. "You can't mail this," he said. "Why not?" "You don't have the right postage." "What's the right postage?" I asked. He shook his head. "You can't mail this. We don't send letters to that embassy." By now, everybody in Ilebo knew of our situation. Nobody wanted to cross the captain, whom Tabitha and I had dubbed El Capitan for lack of any better name. Outside, I looked around to see if there was a postal box into which I could drop a letter, but there wasn't one, nor would it matter if there were, because this lone bird was in charge of the town's entire postal system. Like Mrs. Campion back in Dunquin, no letter or postcard went in or out that he didn't know about. Number 2 in the Ilebo police system was a thin, mean guy with a pencil mustache who was introduced as the town's immigration officer. The purpose of an immigration officer this far inland was never explained. Several times he told us with a vicious smirk that he was going to put us in jail. Here in the middle of the jungle, we were getting the good cop, bad cop routine. Like El Capitan, he wouldn't give us his name. Between ourselves, Tabitha and I called him Rayon because he always wore slick rayon shirts and pants in gaudy African colors. These two were cops on the make, cops after Cadeau big time, not like the street hustlers who demanded a few dollars in Bangui. If they never gave us their names, they would more easily dodge trouble from their higher-ups in case we pressed the matter. I fully intended to. The next night, El Capitan ate with us as our guest at the Palm. As always, he was in uniform and carried himself with dignity. We learned he was from another part of Zaire and was not a member of the local tribe. Unfortunately, it was hard to put on the dog for him when there wasn't much to eat. The hotel offered wild boar, manioc, pig, and chicken. After dinner, he took us to a disco next to the police station. The disco was an open space surrounded by a wall. A band played on one side, and under a covered area in the center stood the bar. Hundreds of people danced here until 3 or 4 in the morning to a combination of Western and African music. The captain didn't come here much, as this was a younger crowd. We all sat at a table and had big brown bottles of beer. Naturally, we paid for everything, straining to be his friend, trying to jolly him into giving us back our passports and speeding us on our way. Pierre's passport was held too, and he was put up in a low-rent hotel. None of us was going anywhere. My conversations with the captain made me understand that in addition to his wanting money, he claimed to be genuinely perplexed about what to do with us. He could read the intentions of his own people and make moral adjudications, but we were so different from his usual disputants that he wasn't sure who was right and who was wrong. He came up with what he thought was a brilliant idea. He would take us to the local Catholic missionaries, who would help him interpret the situation. Father Jean-Pierre and 2 other Belgian priests in their 70s had lived in Ilebo since World War II. Their compound contained a big house and several guest houses, all erected 50 and 60 years before. They generated their own electricity. These 3 priests educated and healed only on the side. Their main calling was managing the local beer monopoly. Perhaps on Sunday they performed a mass, but the other 6 days they distributed beer, as if malt were doing more to further their purposes than sacramental wine. We told them our story, that Pierre had been hired to carry extra supplies, that he'd run out of money and attacked me, and that he now insisted on money to use to return to France. Father Jean-Pierre said, "Let's get everybody together, you, the captain, this young Frenchman, and sort this out." We were elated. This sounded like local justice, jungle style, and perhaps with their favorable endorsement we'd shortly be on our way. A day or two later, we all gathered at the priest's compound. Tabitha had been tense and anxious throughout our stay, but had kept a stiff upper lip. As her French was far better than mine, she was needed here to translate, even though she would rather have stayed back in the hotel. While we were standing around, we were drawn aside by an elderly Belgian, Monsieur Gilbert Tilbert, who told us he lived 100 miles away. He was waiting for the diesel fuel shipment to come in, which he needed for his mining operation. He was staying with the priests, who were old friends, and the only white people for hundreds of miles. "Let me alert you to 2 or 3 things about disputes and problems here," said Monsieur Tilbert in a low growl that didn't carry to the others. "If you get into them, it's best to work them out quickly. If you fall into the local courts, it'll go on forever, maybe years. You'll never get out." He paused, reflecting. I had a sudden vision of a mountain of cadeaux needed to prise ourselves out of the clutches of local lawyers and judges. "We who are here, there aren't many of us left, never want anything to happen to the few foreigners that come through. It makes things more complicated for us." I saw what he was saying. If we lost in court, the idea that the foreigners could be preyed on would take further root. If we won, the Zairians would lose face and want to take it out on somebody, probably him and the priests. "These things are best resolved as speedily and simply as possible," he said. I heard him, loud and clear. Pay up and get out. Forget about being a man of principle. I offered to give Pierre enough money to get back to Kinshasa. He could go to the French embassy there, and it would help him get back to Paris. Father Jean-Pierre asked him if it had been in our agreement that we'd pay his way back to Paris. To his credit, Pierre didn't lie. No, he said, it wasn't. The priest asked me, "Have you paid him all you owe him?" "Yes," I said, "and more." Father Jean-Pierre asked him where the money was, and he shrugged. The priest asked me what he'd done with it. I told them he'd spent it throughout Africa on booze and women. With sullen braggadocio, Pierre acknowledged as much, in what seemed a fear of lying to 3 priests. They retired to deliberate. After a bit, we got a verdict. Father Jean-Pierre said we didn't owe Pierre anything, that his being stuck here was his problem. If we would help him get back to Kinshasa, it would be generous of us. Of course, this was an informal ruling, as the father had no legal authority. I'm convinced there was no such thing as a true legal authority in Zaire. The entire country was Mobutu's run-down plantation, and anything he or his thugs said went. Father Jean-Pierre told the captain we were honorable, legitimate, and responsible people and ought to be let go. Back in town, the captain smiled and said he agreed with the priest's decision. As soon as we had paid for the operation of justice in Alebo, we were certainly free to leave. In short, no matter what the priest decided, he still wanted his bribe of hundreds of thousands of Zaires, a sum that escalated with other charges as each day passed. Like vultures settling near a dying calf, more of the captain's staff gathered each day during our visit to the station. They, too, wanted in on the captain's good fortune. Tabitha and I had a complicated discussion about skipping town. We'd heard that we couldn't go any farther south on our bikes, that from here to Lubumbashi, 600 miles distant, the roads had been officially closed until the end of the rainy season, and that there was no gas. I wanted to hot rod it back to the American embassy in Kinshasa. Tabitha said that was stupid. El Capitan would surely race after us in a 4-wheel drive patrol vehicle, or he would use the radio, drums, or some mysterious other means of African communication to have us snared along the way. I had to admit she was right, and I gave in. On the 6th day, the captain took us home to dinner, where we met his family. All the while that we were his semi-official prisoners, under hotel arrest, I suppose, with our passports in his desk drawer, he was unfailingly dignified and polite. Scuttlebutt said not only was his salary fixed, a big problem in a hyperinflating economy, but that he hadn't been paid in months. In a major financial bind, otherwise honest, upright people will do unprincipled things. Possibly, preying on us was his sole means of economic survival. After all, he told everyone we bumped into, we were a source of enormous curiosity for everybody, grandmothers, shopkeepers, schoolchildren, that we were civilized, cultured people, that Rogers here was a professor, not an evil person. The bad guy in this situation was Pierre, a crook. Yet the captain still wanted the money and wouldn't let us go. Once he suggested he'd use some of the money to put Pierre on a barge heading back to Kinshasa, the opposite direction from us, thus guaranteeing our safety by putting more distance between Pierre and us. So I put my pride in my pocket and made a deal with him for a couple of $1,000 in Zaires that would allow us to leave Ilebo. I didn't have enough Zaires to pay the expenses, but he would solve that problem. The banks might be closed, but a local money changer would open up for him. At the money changers, stacks of $100 bills and Zaires were brought out. After some dickering, I exchanged dollars for what was needed. Once the captain had the Zaires in hand, he said all we had to do now was be vetted by the town's immigration officer. Vetted? Immigration officer? He meant Rayon. We'd been tricked. Over the past few days, Rayon had been giving us greedy looks, and now I knew why. He wanted in on the hot action. Doubtless he had worked out an arrangement for this pair of plump geese to be shuttled to him as soon as his crony, the captain, had done his plucking. My temper hadn't been in good shape throughout this ordeal, and now my outrage exploded, breathing fire and sprouting horns and hooves. "Don't worry," said the captain, his tone soothing. "It's over. Let 'em check your passports and off you go." My new friend put a gentle hand on my shoulder. At the touch, a tremor went through me. I couldn't tell if he was being friendly or guiding a truculent lamb to the slaughter. "I'll take you over there," he said, with his usual broad smile. Rayon worked out of his house, in the sparsely furnished office favored by all country Zairian officials. A desk, a couple of chairs, nothing on the walls, and of course no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters when there was anything at all. Rayon was a man who looked seedy, whose every movement shouted shifty character. He would look seedy in New York, he would look seedy in London, and he looked particularly seedy here in the outback of Zaire. A room off to the side of his office was the jail. As we passed, the door opened and I glimpsed a prisoner. He was in his underwear, his briefs, without other clothes. Soldiers went in and started beating him. This was the jail they hadn't put Pierre into, too terrible for a European. I asked a guard what this fellow had done. He had stolen 4 pigs. He had to stay there until he paid for them, 100,000 Zaires. From behind his desk, delight exuded from every shiny fold of Rayon's face and slick clothes at having us in his clutches. Right off, he asked for our papers. I almost laughed. If papers were his game, he was in trouble. Ours were in perfect order. He went through the documents one by one, then again. "This can't be right," he exclaimed. He went back over them a third time, page by page, card by card, slip by slip. Yes, we had visas. Yes, we had permission to travel in this section near the diamond mines. And yes, we had all the special permits and carnets for our vehicles. I felt a bit smug. I was glad now I had listened back in Kinshasa when a consular official had asked, "Oh, by the way, do you have your economic sector permit?" It had taken us another day to get that particular document, but better to have spent the day there than here, where it would cost 100 times as much. Rayon now insisted that everything of ours be searched. He had our bikes brought over, and under his supervision, his minions took our luggage apart. We scrutinized the searchers to make sure no contraband was slipped in. They missed the money we had squirreled away in various places on the bikes. He could find nothing about which to raise even an eyebrow. Unable to find so much as a comma out of order, Rayon reevaluated the situation and charged us with having 2 persons of the same sex in a room. Several days before, 2 male travelers, an Australian and a New Zealander, had shared a room at the Palm. Now they were gone. "Those guys weren't in our party," I told him. "We don't even know them." "But you were there," said Rayon in a triumphant tone. "You knew about it." "But this doesn't make sense," I said. "If you knew about them, why didn't you arrest them?" "They didn't have any money," said Rayon. For once in my life, I was too flabbergasted to speak. I remembered seeing people of the same sex in the same room in other parts of Zaire, and said so. "On top of that, you've changed money illegally," said Rayon, ignoring my response and rearing back with an even greater flourish. "The Zaires we used for the captain's payoff?" I stammered. Smugly, he nodded. I was even more flabbergasted. According to every guidebook and bit of scuttlebutt, this was perfectly legal. He was inventing charges, hunting for something, anything, with which to stick us. "That can't be illegal," I told him. "The captain himself took us there." "I'm in charge of immigration," he said, "not the captain." We showed him several guidebooks that said changing money was legal. "I don't care," he responded. "I am the law in those matters." I held out. He insisted on a fine. I refused. He shouted. I shouted back. Finally, he threw me in jail, which meant he stuck me in one of the bare rooms in his house. True, I could have crawled out the window, but a soldier was standing in the yard, and I wouldn't have gotten far. I paced about and seethed. Finally, I gave in again. I agreed to pay Rayon a few $100s only if he ensured that we could leave Alebo. We could leave, he said, but only by train, as the roads south were closed. Not only had I arrived at a state of not believing anything he said, but his shifty expression told me he had some ulterior motive, one I couldn't read. Part of the deal, however, was that we had to eat dinner that night at his house. We loathed the man, but this wasn't an invitation we could refuse. I saw his game plan, and it wasn't going to work. He wanted us to feel good toward him so we wouldn't rat on his conduct once we reached Lubumbashi. Fat chance. That night, his wife, his kids, everybody was there. Like all African men, he used his wife as a servant and then ignored her. Tabitha, being a Western woman, could sit and eat with Rayon and me, but his wife had to wait on us. Afterward, he said, "Now we all have to go out and have a beer together. We have to be friends and make up so that everybody has good feelings about all this." Again, it wasn't politic to decline, so we went to the disco. The captain joined us. At the table, they started hitting on us for more money. I blew up. "Now, wait a minute. You told me I don't have to pay anymore. I'm not going to pay anymore, and that's that." They giggled and pointed at me, smiled, and said, "Okay, no more money." While we were drinking, I said, "Since we're all happy together and friends, let me take some pictures, give them to you so you'll have something to remember us." They might not give me their names, but with pictures I could identify them. I took a dozen Polaroids and with great fanfare handed them around, managing to palm 2 with shots of Rayon and the captain. I pictured myself at the Interior Ministry in Lubumbashi saying, "Okay, here are the bastards who did it. Let's put them in jail, have an international incident and all the rest of it." So, 9 days after our detention, we were escorted down to the train yard by the captain, Rayon, and a raggedy troop of local constabulary. As for why they insisted we leave by rail, I gathered that now that we had been plucked clean, they wanted to make sure the indignant geese were shot off by the Iron Horse as far as they could be sent. It's the only time I've ever been run out of town on a rail. Chapter 23. Escape. We bumped and rattled our way south on a flat car through a long stretch of lush jungle. The good news was that Pierre, El Capitan, and Rayon were behind us. The bad news was that this creaking, swaying train was obviously going to take a lot longer than the 2 days promised by the station master. Both of us were full of relief to be away from Elebo, but we were also acutely aware that if for any reason the train masters tossed us off this flat car, we'd wind up smack in the middle of one of the densest, most dangerous jungles on the planet. We learned that every railroad car in the world has its own brakes. We also learned that for safety reasons, only one car with broken brakes could be attached on each train. Naturally, our flat car didn't have brakes, nor did another, which carried a half-dozen self-important Zairian soldiers and a Mercedes-Benz. I figured they had stolen a car for a general and were taking it to him, or perhaps transporting it for repairs. With its roads washed away by the continual rains, the lifeblood of Zaire were these trains and its river barges, which transported copper and diamonds. Without them, everything in the country would die. Everything was chaotic in Zaire, and rail service was no exception. Not only were there lots of stops and hours of waiting, but in the major stations every car was uncoupled and a new train was made up. Some stretches of the railroad used diesel locomotives, and some used electric. To compound the confusion, there was rarely any fuel. So, as our flat car traveled from station to station, we kept getting bumped by the soldiers and that damn Mercedes-Benz. At every station, their flat car would be the one car attached to the next train, ours the one forced to wait. I repeatedly asked the rail officials to give us another car, one with brakes, but out here in the jungle, there was no depot platform on which to unload and reload our heavy motorcycles. In every town, the police found us and asked for our papers. Luckily for us, Africa had chiefly been colonized by the French and the English, so language was no problem. Back in Russia and China, English was still the second language of choice, although Japanese is rapidly supplanting English in China. Indeed, nearly half the people in the world speak some measure of English, and up to here we got by virtually everywhere with English, Tabitha's French, a smattering of local words, and sign language. I was worried that these local cops would pull the same stunt as the captain in Rayon had, but they didn't. It was astonishing to realize that the Siberians were more efficient than the Zairians. In Siberia, we had also traveled about 600 miles by flat car, but there it had taken us 2.5 days. In Zaire, 9. The long waits gave us time to explore the villages, towns, and cities along the tracks. We stopped for hours in Kananga, a major city. Near the tracks were hundreds of old rails, ripped up and thrown to the side along with thousands of crossties. The waste was staggering. Here, in a country short of good steel, rails lay rusting. I supposed a clever foreigner could simply come through here, sprinkle around a little largesse, pick up this stuff, and make a fortune. Why hadn't the locals melted it down into something useful? Because this was Zaire, because nobody here was organized enough. We walked through Kananga, which had once been a bustling, thriving city. Now the old Belgian colonial buildings were dilapidated, sagging with decades of neglect, and shuttered. "Look," I said, "that used to be the post office." "There, that used to be a hotel," Tabitha said. "That used to be a fancy restaurant. That was a tailor shop, a school, the city hall, a warehouse." The train station had been built 50 to 100 years before and hadn't been painted in decades, probably not since the Belgians had left. Most of its rooms, the old waiting room, the men's room, the ladies' room, the restaurant, were closed off and locked. A couple of offices were open, one of which was the trainmaster's. As usual, it was spare, a small bare room with a desk, a lamp, and a decades-old telephone that only sometimes worked. An almost new four-wheel drive Land Rover passed us. "My God," I said, "where did that come from?" On its door was painted the answer, "Donated by the Baptist Church of Jackson." A fat, well-dressed African was behind the wheel, obviously the king of the local economy, the baron of these parts, driving a vehicle that the Jackson Baptists back in the States had given him. He certainly didn't give the impression that he was on churchly business. He seemed to be using the vehicle to consolidate more earthly arrangements. On our way out of Kananga, we passed the defunct Dodge Plymouth dealership, which looked to have once been large. There was a garage. On the wall were fading posters of 60s cars, and over there the showroom. But now the glass was broken and the front boarded up. In my hometown of Demopolis, Alabama, the Dodge Plymouth dealership had closed 30 years before. From the similar style of these ancient posters and the out-of-date logo, I guessed this dealership had been abandoned at about the same time. We explored many towns like Kananga, all of which saddened us. Water towers rusted and falling down. 2- and 3-story buildings on either side of once prosperous main streets, in ruins now, boarded up, crumbling. An entire people had spent money, energy, and the capital of their souls erecting and maintaining these now collapsing structures. Not only was city after city in ruins, but also the farms, plantations, and ranch houses we passed. Vast amounts of capital and energy and lives tossed away by the careless Zairians. The train stopped again. To pass the time, we went to the marketplace, where we found grasshoppers and locusts on sale. Tabitha turned up her nose, but I bought and ate some locusts, finding them tasty, crunchy and sweet. One entrepreneur in a corner of a vast, nearly empty store displayed an extraordinary collection of second-hand T-shirts, 300 or so. They were printed with Western designs, everything from the stuffy Yale Divinity School logo to funky pictures of the Grateful Dead. Although his shirts were used, he had a well-stocked display, a selection that would have done proud any college shop in America. This I understood. Here was a guy who realized his specialty was T-shirts, and he was in the marketplace working hard at his trade. Where had he gotten these shirts? In another corner of this store were boxes of used clothes for sale, each carton marked with the names of various American churches that had donated them. Do you think the people who donated those meant for them to be sold? Tabitha asked. She was still a card-carrying liberal from Manhattan's Upper West Side, but the card was becoming tattered. I somehow doubt it, I said. No country in the world is wetter than Zaire. If you need water, all you have to do is put a bucket outside for a day. Yet we came across one Peace Corps volunteer whose job was to dig wells. True, the wells fell in within a year or two from neglect, as the Zairians didn't need or maintain them, but his job was to sink them, and sink them he did. I wonder if I can ever vote for foreign aid again, Tabitha said. We haven't seen one good use it's been put to on this whole trip. In fact, foreign aid's chief byproduct is to prop up bad regimes. What foreign aid teaches dictators and the political hangers-on around them is how to obtain foreign aid, not how to make their countries productive. What foreign aid teaches a country's best and brightest businessmen is how to suck up to the politicians who administer it, not how to build businesses that earn hard currencies. In a country suffused with foreign aid, the military doesn't learn how to defend the state from external enemies, but how to protect its dictatorial masters from internal dissent. Foreign aid drives Western State Department types, International Monetary Fund bankers, academics, and UN bureaucrats to concoct endless studies on how aid should be spent. Studies which few of the official brigands who receive the aid bother to read. What we need to teach developing countries is how to open their markets, how to make their businesses competitive with those in other countries. How can a country become prosperous without prosperous businesses? Have there ever been prosperous businesses without entrepreneurs having the guts to risk their capital, time, and energy to increase their wealth? Isn't this so elementary it's self-evident? To take its rightful place in the global marketplace, each country needs to develop its own competitive advantage, its own products that it produces cheaper and better than any other. Foreign aid postpones, even cripples this development of its business people, leading at best to economic stagnation, at worst to a loss of pride and spirit, which are vital to every successful society. Deciding to chance the roads, we left the train 150 miles before Lubumbashi. After 9 days and 500 miles of stop-and-go riding, the torpid pace was driving us crazy. We were told there were no gas stations till the city, but I figured we had enough in our tanks to reach it. Besides, surely the trusty black market wouldn't let us down. They were right about there being no gas stations, and I was wrong about the black market. Even when we got to Lubumbashi, even though this was a major city, a gigantic city, at the first gas station there wasn't any gas. No, the attendant didn't expect more anytime soon. "Where can we get gas?" I asked. He gave us directions to another station. We drove the 30 blocks and said that we didn't have gas. The attendant shrugged and said, "Well, who does?" His station was out too. We pressed him, and he directed us to yet another station. Finally, we arrived at the city's main gas station. They had a little and agreed to sell us 20 liters. Between them, our bikes held 60. A carton of cigarettes helped us buy 30 liters, 15 for each bike. Naturally, I tried to get him to sell us more, but he was afraid to, figuring he could go only so far in doing us a favor. This was the only gas in Lubumbashi, the South's major city. Gas here wasn't expensive, simply unavailable, the way it had been cheap and hard to get in Siberia and Russia. But this made sense. Fix a price too low, and no one wants to supply it. Not individuals, not corporations, and not governments. We went back the next morning and got another 10 liters. We drove to other gas stations trying to get more gas, but we had no luck. We came back to the main station later, precisely at the time the attendant had told me to. "No gas," he said with his usual shrug. Out of frustration, I shouted, "What kind of country is this? Why isn't there any gas?" Which meant absolutely nothing to this guy. What kind of country was this? How can you not have any gas? It made as much sense as screaming, "Why don't you have any kryptonite? What kind of planet is this?" A white woman pulled into the station, her small son in the front seat. With a stunned expression, she asked, "Qu'est-ce qu'il y a? What's going on?" The station attendant murmured, "The boss's wife." She had the look of somebody who wanted to ask, "Have the Martians landed? Have the colonialists returned?" Over and over, we'd been told that nobody could save Zaire except for the departed colonialists, but they no longer wanted to come back. Tabitha and I, a little astonished ourselves, explained our situation. We gave her the whole song and dance, how we were trying to go around the world on motorcycles, and here this station didn't have any gas. We threw ourselves on our mercy. What did we do now? Her name was Eloise, and it turned out that her husband was the regional head of Petro Zaire, a part of the large Belgian oil company that had continued its presence here. He managed the Southern Triangle for the company, a third of the country. At her suggestion, we followed her, and she led us to her home. She and her husband lived behind big walls in a spacious villa. There we were given something cool to drink. We met her mother, Madame Toussaint, more than 70 years old, who had been born in Zaire. This elderly lady had been trying for 5 days to get to Kinshasa by air. Nothing special, just passage on a scheduled flight between two of the country's 3 major cities, like flying from Chicago to New York in the States. Every day, Madame Toussaint went to the airport, ready to fly, and every day she had to return home because there was no fuel. I was amazed. We were in the house of the fuel czar of the Southern Triangle, and his wife's mother not only couldn't fly to Kinshasa, but because of the lack of telephones and the general muck-up of the economy, she had to trek out to the airport every day to find out whether there was fuel. It took hard foreign currency, not Zaire's, to buy that aviation fuel abroad. Doubtless the airline had to pay for it in advance. No sensible businessman was going to advance credit to Zaire, particularly not to its state-owned airline. Eloise sent a servant around back. He reappeared with a 20-liter jerry can and topped off our tanks. We tried to pay her, but she wouldn't think of taking money and invited us for lunch. Her husband wasn't in town. He was in Kinshasa trying to deal with the lack of fuel, which was a major crisis. There was always a major crisis in Zaire. Her family had been here since 1921, she said. We listened to stories of her school years in Belgium, how she'd often come and gone in those halcyon days. Her father had been an engineer who'd come to put in the railroad. She wistfully recalled how good the roads were all those years ago. Back under Belgian rule, she said, each town was responsible for the road that came through its part, and they took care of them. The roads were always paved. Now, nobody is responsible for anything, so all the roads have collapsed. Eloise described the rich plantations that used to be here, the lush farms outside of town, how much food the farmers had produced, the plentiful produce in the markets. I said that someone should bring in the Chinese to farm, that they would go wild in such fertile conditions. No, they tried that, she said. Even the Chinese gave up because the government was so hopeless. No cooperation, no spare parts, no gasoline, nothing. I was shocked. The Chinese didn't need a lot, and if they, the most frugal and efficient producers in the world, had given up, it really was hopeless. It meant nobody could work with Mobutu. Madame Toussaint said that back in the old days there had been 3,000 working plantations around Lubumbashi. Today, you could count them on your fingers. In Lubumbashi, we met a middle-aged black businessman, Moise Kela, a former economics professor fluent in English, who had grown up in colonial times. I've known both, he said, colonial days and these awful times now. Things will only become worse here. We need somebody to come in and organize us, bring in capital and sell our products abroad. We need that. We need the money. We need the discipline. And we need the know-how. Trouble is, even if companies from America, France, and Belgium wanted to come back, their own left wing would raise a hue and cry. The current fashion in political thinking won't allow its capitalists to set this country right. What we need is to be colonized again, but nobody can or will be bothered anymore. The record bears out Moise's thesis. Even though both were oil-rich countries, 30 years ago Nigeria on a per capita basis was wealthier than Indonesia. At the same time, Ghana was wealthier than Thailand on a per capita basis. Both then were agriculture-based economies. Over the past 30 years, Nigeria and Ghana renounced colonialism, foreign capitalists, and foreign expertise, saying they would use African expertise and African capital. They sought foreign aid, flirted with Marxism, had an affair with socialism, and married statism. Like the United States in the 19th century, Thailand and Indonesia embraced foreign capital and foreign expertise. They took little foreign aid. Today, Nigeria and Ghana are among the world's poorest countries, while Thailand and Indonesia are booming, prime examples of the economic miracle on the Pacific Rim. Their peoples have become wealthier. These aren't arguments in musty economic journals. They were experiments over decades involving the lives of tens of millions of people, tests that pit vital economic ideas against each other. I can't imagine a better test, one that much of the world, outside the United States, is seeing and taking to heart. One day, Zaire will break up, probably into 4 parts around its largest cities, Kinshasa, Kananga, Lubumbashi, and Kisangani, but possibly into many smaller divisions. The roads are such mud wallows no one travels between these cities by surface transportation, other than by rail and slow-moving barge. True, the geography and climate make maintaining an infrastructure difficult. Even in the dry season it is always raining, and no sooner do you put in a highway or a railroad than a section washes away. However, when the Belgian colonialists ran the country, they built an infrastructure and kept it together. The irony is that if there were a good economic base and a decent political system, Zaire would be enormously rich. If an investment company married American agricultural technology with Chinese farmers, it could make a fortune here. Even now the crops grew without supervision. You didn't even have to speak to them, much less water them. The soil is incredibly rich and lush, and because it is so near the equator, there are 3 growing seasons a year. At one time, the country exported food to Europe. Now it imports food. Even though there is no more fertile place on the planet, Zaire can't feed itself. Instead, in the Zairean markets, we find only manioc, along with locusts and grasshoppers, certainly not domesticated forms of livestock. Once in a while we came across a half-dozen misshapen, withered tomatoes, which always made us wonder where the hell they had come from. Zaire will fall apart completely. The only forces that have held it together this long are Mobutu and American money and arms, along with whatever Russian support the dictator could sneak in. Both superpowers claimed they kept Mobutu in power to create stability in Central Africa. Now that the Cold War is over, there is no reason to support him. His people hate him, and he is going down. Other countries in this part of the world, Mozambique and Angola, have already experienced their vicious civil wars. Their currencies have already collapsed. These, not Zaire, are the places on which a smart investor should keep his eye. Zaire hasn't had its final civil war yet. That horror will come as local chiefs and barons snatch at the country's wealth after something dislodges Mobutu. As an investor, I wait until the wars are fought, the borders are redrawn, and the newly elected democratic governments are eager to make something of the country's resources. Here, I thought, there ought to be a period of stability once the borders were redrawn and Mobutu was gone. That would be the time to pile in. Once war starts here, the end will be near, because nobody is left who wants to finance a conflict in Zaire. There is nothing in it for anybody, because there is nothing left to Zaire. What must happen in the real world is that Zaire must emulate Thailand and Indonesia and welcome unfettered outside expertise, management, and capital, as the United States did in the 19th century, or disintegrate before it can return to true economic health. I know there are a lot of decent people with good intentions in the West who think we should ship in aid to help countries at this point of disillusion. However, the Red Cross, the United Nations, and other charities should let them go. Let them disintegrate instead of propping them up. Ultimately, shipping in aid will only prolong the agony and the time the Zairians must spend fumbling at the bottom of their economic cycle. Instead of 1 or 2 years at the bottom, they would then have to spend 3 or 4. Only being on their own will give the Zairians a chance to regroup and make a solid new start. However this appears, it's not cruel, but the fastest and most reliable way to revitalize a shattered society and economy. How so? Because at the bottom people will say, well, this is my tribe, my group, my whatever. They will work together and become self-sufficient. Law and order will then return. Whether it's the Soviet Union breaking up, a mafia chieftain running lawless and breaking kneecaps, or Zairian warlords pillaging, people demand the rule of order. During the breakup, yes, there will be a period of anarchy and chaos, but that will become too exhausting, too chaotic for everyone involved. Finally, they'll say, we want stability. People can't take living in chaos and warfare for long. Better to let things collapse quickly than drag out the misery, as dragging it out will still lead to chaos and warfare, only far worse, like a wound that's neglected and left to fester. Only after collapse can true peace come. After all, tens of billions of dollars in foreign aid have been poured into Africa by both the West and the Communists, much of it guided by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Scandinavians, and the United Nations. No one, however, can name one developing country in Africa that has become developed due to foreign aid. Once there's peace, somebody will say, gosh, we're really good at growing tomatoes. Why don't we sell them to the guy down the street? So they'll start a little business, one with a firm underfooting, not one imposed by a Peace Corps volunteer or an IMF banker. There's been so much meddling in the 20th century that except for places like Taiwan and South Korea, which received military aid, it is hard to find a once undeveloped country that makes a good model of economic self-sufficiency. However, in the 19th century in America and Europe, there were booms and busts that weren't manipulated by foreign aid, and those economies still grew rapidly. For thousands of years, African kingdoms functioned without the burden of nation-states as we know them. Many had complex social structures supported by solid economies, court systems, and wealth. If African tribesmen put together a civilization once, they can put one together again. Out of these tribes would come true local government. These new states would make voluntary alignments with others that would take root. rather than have order imposed upon them by Mobutu or the United Nations. When you consider the dozens of ethnic groups forced together under one system of government here, it's easy to see that Zaire should never have been a country in the first place. It's been one for only a little more than 100 years, a patchwork quilt stitched together by the Belgians. The rest of us, particularly those who like to meddle in others' lives, should stay away and let Zaire disintegrate into its natural shape. Every time we prop it up, we'll get it wrong. We should let nature take its course, allow these people to sort out their own problems. In the West, we have the hubris, born of statist notions, to think we can change history, force the world into a political, social, and economic configuration that we find pleasing or familiar. We cannot. There aren't enough soldiers or money in the world to stop the coming collapse in Zaire. Chapter 24. Zambia and the Great Zimbabwe. We were delighted that Zambia was close to Lubumbashi. By now we had been in Zaire almost 5 weeks. Both of us were heartily sick of it. We pushed on south and arrived at the border. As usual, we dreaded the crossing, with its crowds of people, cars, and trucks, its chaos, paperwork, and the bribes we would have to pay. However, entering Zambia turned out to be simple. The border guard spoke Oxford English. We went into the customs shed and said, "We're tourists going through." And it was a snap. All of a sudden, we were in civilization again. Civilization by African standards, that is. If the average American were dropped into Zambia, he would recoil at the primitive conditions. But here, the roads were paved. The people were sane. The currency was declining, but not collapsing. They had gas. There was food. You could buy vegetables. There was soda pop. Even though everybody was nice as pie at the border, we jumped on our bikes and took off, obeying the first rule of crossing borders. When you make it across, get away before someone changes his mind. We immediately ran into a military checkpoint, but we were waved through as if they saw we weren't emerald or gold smugglers. Few, if any, white travelers come through here, and no long-distance travelers of any race, much less outlanders and chaps and riding what to them were exotic machines. What a relief after having gone through so many police and military checkpoints in Zaire. Around the world, military checkpoints are often an attempt to deter smugglers. Governments want to prevent the export of the local product that brings them the most hard currency. As emeralds were important to the Zambian economy, the government had instructed its citizens that it, and only it, was allowed to buy emeralds. The government set the price, naturally a good bit lower than the world price. If you wanted to sell emeralds in Zambia, you had to sell them cheaply to the government, or run afoul of the law. It took emerald producers no more than a second to figure out they could make more money by smuggling their product outside the country. Such government-established monopolies were a worldwide racket. To give a few examples, there was cocoa in Ghana, coffee in Colombia and other Latin American countries, gold in Russia, bananas in Nicaragua, tin in Bolivia, tobacco in Zimbabwe, oil and gas in Libya and Algeria. Some of Zambia's roads near the economic centers were very good. Its markets had lots of produce, and gasoline and electricity were available. I couldn't figure what would happen here after its socialist leader and benevolent strongman, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, departed. He was the glue holding the country's 25 ethnic groups together. In the pantheon of third world leaders, he was regarded as a hallowed saint. Saint or not, he was in the process of being thrown out because his statist policies weren't working. Zambia's 7.8 million people had been jammed together without geographic, ethnic, or linguistic rationale, a collection of land and peoples that the British had cobbled together as Northern Rhodesia. I doubted Zambia would exist for long in one piece. We heard the roar and spotted the steam cloud from Victoria Falls from 6 to 7 miles away. The natives called it the cloud that thunders. The falls were awesome, all the more so because we could walk right up to and into them. Around the footbridge across the pool, the mist was so thick it actually made a rain shower. Baboons were everywhere. The falls were 1.5 times as wide as Niagara and almost twice as high. The water roared down in a canyon which has formed a pocket, not at all like Niagara and far more majestic. Over the centuries it had cut a deep river channel that wound back and forth in a zigzag through the jungle. As we'd crossed from Zambia into Zimbabwe, we noticed an immense difference in their approach to the falls. Both countries had full access to this tourist attraction to use to draw business. However, on the Zambia side, there had been only one decent hotel. Socialism and government control precluded choice and competition. On the Zimbabwe side, tourist facilities were highly developed, with hotels, stores, villages, airplane rides, tour groups, every amenity a traveler might want. The 5-star Victoria Falls Hotel, with its manicured lawns and 1907 fixtures, was as elegant as Raffles in Singapore or the Savoy. This side of the border was capitalistic. Entrepreneurs could develop whatever business they thought would turn a profit, and so they met the needs of the market. Back on the Zambian side, there was only that one drab hotel, because Dr. Kaunda, elected in 1964 and still in power, controlled everything. After the transformation of the British Protectorate Northern Rhodesia into Zambia, its citizens had been granted elections, one man, one vote, but only once. The country had been stuck with the socialist dictatorship ever since. Naturally, when tourists visited Victoria Falls, they went to the Zimbabwe side. Here was an object lesson in the difference between the free market and statism with its incredible restrictions. Capitalism was battling statism right across the river, and it was hardly a contest. Zimbabwe had a checkered political history. In 1923, it had become the self-governing British colony of Southern Rhodesia. In 1965, it unilaterally declared its independence, and a white-dominated Republican regime was established. In 1978, it became a biracial one, with a black puppet administration controlled by whites. For a year or so, the British returned to run the country. In 1980, it reached its independence again as the Republic of Zimbabwe. As happened in many African countries, in 1987, it became a one-party state. It had lots of natural resources and a relatively advanced economy oriented toward foreign trade and supported by a sophisticated infrastructure. In addition to large tobacco exports, asbestos, chromium, copper, and other minerals were shipped to a wide variety of foreign markets. For a while, agricultural self-sufficiency permitted the export of corn and other crops to its neighbors. Like other African countries, however, mismanagement, drought, and falling commodity prices had since contributed to fiscal difficulties, including budget deficits and persistent inflation. As in China today, the government still spouted Marxist-Leninist rhetoric, but it was being forced to explore relaxing its control of the economy in favor of private business, industry, and agriculture. We stayed outside Hwange National Park in the Ivory Lodge, one of the world's most unusual resorts. Each of its dozen suites was a treehouse in the middle of the jungle. Although the bathrooms were at the base of the trees, each treehouse had a full bedroom, one as big as you'd find anywhere, and was surrounded by a porch. There were never more than 24 guests at the lodge, all living in the treehouses with the birds. A nearby small waterhole drew lions, giraffes, zebras, and other jungle animals, which guests could view from their porches. The guests ate gourmet meals in the main lodge at a single large table. The owners, holdovers from the colonial period, had spared no expense. The fixtures were new, the plumbing modern, and the rooms well appointed. They figured to break even at 40% occupancy and to make a fortune at 100%. Most of the guests rose before dawn to watch jungle animals gather at the larger water holes inside the park. After viewing the animals and taking pictures, they returned to eat a big English breakfast together. One night, Tabitha and I heard elephants making loud grunts and trumpet calls below us. These were young male elephants, about 12 years old, who traveled in packs because they were young bucks, a bit like our teenagers. When they were older than 12, they found a female and paired off, or whatever elephants did. We figured this would be a terrific chance to see them up close. We climbed down, got a driver, piled into a jeep, and drove to the waterhole to see them. We were watching a dozen by the light of the full moon when something spooked them. They immediately charged, stampeding toward us. We were stuck, couldn't move. We were paralyzed. When they were 50 or 60 yards away, it was clear that Tabitha, the driver, and I were going to be trampled underfoot. Somehow, at the last minute, they veered away. Later, the lodge's owner told us elephants don't like to step on anything squishy that would make them slip and fall. They avoid mud, slick leaves, and I suppose motorcyclists filled with slippery blood. In Zimbabwe, many farms were in ruins. These had been taken from the white settlers, expropriated, and turned over to locals to reward them for whatever. Today, lots of them stand empty, even though 15 years ago they were prosperous and exported food. The government of Zimbabwe has decided to have a cheap food policy so everybody could get inexpensive grain. What could be more benign? They set a low price for corn and forced producers to sell to them. Back in the mid-'80s, before this policy, the country had produced 1.8 million tons of corn a year. That's tons, not bushels. Now it was producing 30,000, a drop of 98%. This was yet another example of a government stupidly setting an artificially low price and thereby getting a low supply. The same stupidity applied by Russia to virtually every product. And how did the government explain this failure? It's the drought. Was this the truth? My answer, as usual, was to check the flow of money to find out. In its wisdom, the government had never regulated the production and sale of flowers. Back in the mid-'80s, the country's farmers had produced $5 million worth of flowers, which they exported to obtain hard currencies. This year, they were producing $200 million worth. The ability of farmers to raise flowers had apparently gone up some 40 times during this catastrophic drought. How was it possible to raise flowers and not corn? Because the government hadn't set the price of flowers. Farmers could obtain rand, dollars, and Deutschmarks for them, so they raised all they could. Had the government left the price of corn alone, people with capital would have been attracted, irrigation systems would have been laid down, and even inefficient growers would have made money. There would have been corn. The government should never have set the price, and instead allowed it to rise naturally. The Russians got themselves into a pass where, to get the price of fuel to a market level, they had to raise it 150 times. If they had let it creep upward over the years, nobody would have noticed. Here in the United States, we all say, "Gosh, I remember when gas was 20 cents a gallon." But there aren't riots in the streets because it costs $1 now. However, if it went from 20 cents to $1 in 1 week, there might be riots. It is only when a government artificially holds a price back, and then all of a sudden releases it, that the price explodes, and a political crisis arrives. Human beings don't grasp this intuitively. History has shown over and over that a government doesn't have to worry about high prices because they bring in supply and eventually drive prices down. The proper concept is certainly taught in economics courses, but it's so expedient to cap a price that politicians often try to do so. It's never successful, always diminishing supply and making the situation worse. One of the reasons I was bullish on parts of the world was that over and over I saw countries realizing they could not control prices, that it wouldn't work. Statism was on the run. More and more governments had tried and had such obvious failures with this policy that they'd given up on it. For every Zimbabwe where price controls were still in effect, there was a Poland allowing the marketplace to set the price, and the resultant natural increase in supply. Once we got to Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, we tried again to lodge a complaint against the captain and Rayon with the Zairian ambassador, as we had tried to do in Lusaka, the capital of Zambia. Once more, we got nowhere. Since the next country we would pass through that had a Zairian embassy was the United States, there was little we could do after this. It would be a long time before we could even hope to pursue this matter again. I went to see a government official and told him I thought this country's prospects were great. Sometime in the future I wanted to invest here. If I invest, I asked, can I take my money out when I want? No, once it's here you can't, the minister said. We want to build up our country's foreign exchange reserves. It's in the best interest of everyone, including you as a foreign investor. But don't you understand what you're doing? I asked, exasperated. You're preventing capital from coming in, which you desperately need. Nobody's going to put his money into a country from which he can't withdraw it. No, we must have exchange controls, he said. Otherwise we won't have any capital. It'll all flee to Switzerland. Now, wait a minute, I said. I'm here. I want to give you foreign capital. I want to bring money in, but you won't let me take it back out when I want to. We must protect our foreign reserves. Don't you understand that if you let the money go back and forth freely, I said, a lot of money might leave, but eventually a lot more will come in? Mexico was finding that out now, having finally allowed a freely convertible currency. In Latin America over the past 50 years, there had been an enormous amount of flight capital precisely because of regulations and exchange controls. What these officials never realized was that when the system collapsed and they imposed exchange controls, of course people rushed to get their money out. In their efforts to stop it, they actually created currency smuggling. Prosperous citizens would sell their farms and buy stamps, antiques, gold, and diamonds and sneak their wealth out. The ways were unlimited. But no one was ever going to sneak his money into such a country. The 21st century will not look like the 20th century. One huge difference will be the incredible mobility of people, goods, information, and capital. A major theme of 20th century economics has been the limitations on capital through exchange controls. In exchange control's simplest incarnation, it means if an American went to London, he could take, say, only $3,000 out of the country without permission. He could not take more unless he paid a special tax, if at all. Now, why would a government care how many zlotys, francs, or dollars a citizen took out? If I take my dollars and exchange them for 5,000 francs, there are 5,000 fewer francs in America's foreign reserves, in the total of its citizens and the government's franc holdings. When an American importer needs to pay for the wine he's brought in from France, there will be 5,000 fewer francs here for him to purchase. To Americans, it seems as if there's an ocean of francs available, with no problem in obtaining them. However, the only way our banking system got those francs in the first place was from our selling something to the French. For many years, we sold more to the rest of the world than we bought. Therefore, we built up or saved a lot of foreign currency: yen, Deutschmarks, francs, and pounds. Whenever an American wanted to buy French wine, in essence, he went down to the bank and got some of those saved-up French francs and sent them back to France and said, "Sell me some wine." As I have tried to explain, solving the problem of a lack of foreign reserves with exchange controls doesn't work. These controls are a band-aid. Once again, one person, one entity, the central bank, will decide what's important for an entire society, even if the product is tractors. Only when the market is free, unleashed if you will, and the local currency finds its own level, will people then start doing what comes naturally: dig up emeralds, sell them to France, get francs, and sell those francs to somebody who wants to bring in either a case of wine or a tractor. If the holder of francs is reluctant to sell them, then the wine and tractor importers will bid up the price until he can't resist. It's this kind of vigorous activity that builds up a country's economy and its foreign reserves. Even though a canny investor like John Templeton will invest in a country before the currency becomes freely convertible, I will only go in and get the lay of the land. I won't put my money into a country until it actually makes its currency convertible. In this vein, I urge all my American friends to open a foreign bank account, if only as an insurance policy. Second best is to buy foreign currencies in a brokerage or bank account here. People have life insurance and automobile insurance policies and never expect to need them. If you have to use them, however, you're glad you have them. On that basis, every American should put some money out of the country. I don't know what's going to happen to the U.S. dollar over the next 25 years, but I know what's happened in the past 25. It's lost a lot of value, over a third compared with other major currencies. The fiscal situation in the United States is so bad that ultimately, during this decade, I'm sure we're going to have exchange controls. The dollar will have become so worthless that U.S. citizens will be as desperate for foreign currencies as the Italians are today. Our government will limit how much money we can take out of our country. You won't be able to go to England for a vacation unless you can do it on, say, $2,500. As of now, it's patriotic to send your money abroad. The government wants the dollar to go down, to be worth less. It is American government policy for the dollar to sink, because the government thinks then American goods will be more competitive on the world market. American steelworkers will have more jobs. American farmers will sell their wheat and corn more readily. Our government is encouraging its citizens to sell dollars, and I'm right in there with them. But unfortunately, the dollar will continue to go down until its fall becomes so out of control that the government will snarl and blame our problems on evil financiers. Once controls are put on, the currency will fall farther because everybody will try to smuggle it out. A year or two after this, my mother in Alabama will call me and say, "I gotta get some money out of the country." I'll know when we're near the bottom. Many of us will be on planes, 2 suitcases full of money, flying to London or roaring across the Great Lakes. Once again, exchange controls won't have worked. Particularly today, with telecommunications and mobility, they can't work. But of course, being a government, ours won't acknowledge it's a root cause of the problem. One of the reasons I'm so bullish on Latin America is that its governments have tried exchange controls for decades and have now eliminated them. Latin Americans have gone through the complete cycle. They know. That's why they're ahead of the Africans. The Latin Americans have learned after 70 years that exchange controls don't work. The Africans are just now getting to the stage of, okay, we know exchange controls don't work, so now let's try something else. Unfortunately, the Africans also have a problem with their colonialist-imposed borders, whereas in Latin America, the borders are reasonably stable and a bit more rational. We visited the ruins of the Great Zimbabwe with our friend Stan Mudenge, a historian and nationalist who has written the only history of pre-colonial southern African empires, none of which unfortunately had left any written record. Thus, by necessity, he had to be somewhat more vague about his historical sources than he would have been if writing a Princeton doctoral thesis. The ruins of this old stone city were the largest ancient structures south of the Sahara. According to Stan, in terms of importance, they were on par historically with the ruins of the Mayans, the Romans, and the Aztecs. To me, the Great Zimbabwe looked to have been a large fortress with outbuildings, perhaps like that of an extensive medieval castle with a good-sized town at the base of its commanding hill. From the Zimbabweans' point of view, these ruins dated from when they had ruled the world. Obviously, these ruins were of some kind of kingdom that had been considerably developed. This said a lot to Africans, that long ago their ancestors had raised elaborate structures and presumably an intricate civilization. This maze-like collection of stone ruins was set on a large steep hill with various approaches. Every day, workers would have had to bring up water, food, wood, and the other necessities of life, which would have required quite an organization of labor. So here was ant-like behavior in Africa, maybe as well organized for its time as that of the Japanese or the Germans today. Here was hierarchy and discipline. African nationalists use the Great Zimbabwe to make the point that the Africans are as historic as anyone, particularly when they're castigated for not having more in the way of ancient civilizations. They had other such ancient civilizations, they claim. Unlike the stone buildings of Rome and Central America, their forefathers' structures had been built of wood. As wood rots, and in the jungle it rots fast. Nothing of those magnificent civilizations was extant. No buildings, no ruins, no implements, and no historical records. I wondered what had happened. Why had the Zimbabweans fallen back into tribe and jungle life? After all, we know Arab traders had come this far south. Zimbabwean gold artifacts have been found in Arabia, and if the Arab traders had taken science and outside exposure to Europe, surely they had been carried south to Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, we needed to get visas for South Africa. The two countries didn't have a political relationship, but fortunately there was a South African trade office here, which functioned as the local embassy. In front of the building, black people were lined up around the block. "What's this all about?" I asked the cab driver. "Those are people wanting to get visas to go to South Africa," he said. South Africa? I was shocked. We went in and asked for visas, but we were told there would be a 4-week delay. "Why?" I asked. "Because all these other people want to go to South Africa too," I was told. Mercifully, we were able to persuade the trade representative that we didn't want to jump the queue and give anyone a hard time. We needed to keep moving because of the oncoming South American winter. At my side, Tabitha, still lugging along her tattered card identifying her as a bleeding heart liberal, spoke up in a puzzled voice. "Wait a minute, I'm missing something here. Why are all these people trying to leave a black-run workers' paradise to go live in the racist state of South Africa?" The Zimbabweans were voting with their feet, the strongest ballot of all. For them, South Africa was the land of opportunity, and they were in a headlong rush to leave one Africa to get into another Africa that the Western press condemned so roundly. We were eager to find out why. Chapter 25. Botswana. We had heard that customs officials in Botswana were lackadaisical about travelers bringing in money, but as we approached the border, I was wary. We were asked to fill out a form indicating how much money we were bringing in, as we had in all those wretched countries with exchange controls. I asked the border guard, "Do we have to change all our money?" "No, bring in and take out anything you want." "When we change money, do we have to get this form stamped?" Many countries with exchange controls not only insist on knowing about every penny you bring in, but each time you change money, they want the transaction stamped on your currency exchange form. When you leave the country, you must show the form. "Okay," they'll say, "let's see the $1,900 you have left." If you don't show them you still have $1,900, they figure you exchanged it on the black market, and the central bank didn't get its whack at it. This was the same governmental racket as Zambia's buying all its citizens emeralds and Bolivia their tin, a state monopoly on foreign currencies. "Do I have to show this form when I change money?" I asked again. "No." "Do I ever have to turn this form in again?" "I think when you leave you have to turn it in, but I'm not sure." If nobody knew much about it, this was clearly a form that was archaic, a holdover from the past. We drove away, on highways even better than those in Zimbabwe, which had been pretty good. So I liked Botswana right off the bat. 1, it was easy to get into. 2, there was no black market in the currency. Guys on little chairs by the side of the road offered to change money for a small commission, a convenience to save a trip to the bank. The mere fact that the currency was freely convertible made me think about investing here. You may be a brilliant investor, but if you have to get your money out through the black market, it's going to be an incredible hassle, particularly if a lot of money is involved. If someone local, like an arm of the government, knows about you, doesn't like you, and wants your money, no matter how smart you are, you've lost it if you can't get your money out. Sometimes I won't invest in a country because I know it'll change the rules on me. Kuwait was one of those countries. The Kuwaiti stock market in the late 70s was a gigantic bubble, like the tulip bubble in 17th century Holland. I wanted desperately to sell it short because when it burst, the profits were going to be unbelievable. At that time in Kuwait, if you wanted to buy $1 million worth of stock, all you had to do was write a check for $1 million, post-date it for 6 months, and give it to your broker. Whether or not you had the million in the bank didn't matter. Naturally, the broker couldn't cash it till 6 months later. If the stock went up, you made the profit. Under this system of financing, as you can imagine, stocks went only one way, up, buoyed by an ocean of worthless checks. This was so much fun that many buyers decided to buy $10 million worth. No problem, said the brokers. Just give us a post-dated check. Government clerks wrote checks for $20 million and $30 million, all post-dated. 6 months later, the investors were supposed to sell the stock and pay the money back. But of course they didn't. They wrote another check, this one for $50 million or $100 million. It was obvious that this had to explode. The Kuwaiti currency was freely convertible, which meant I should be able to whisk my profits out after the crash. Still, much as I was aching to, I didn't sell the market short, because I knew just as sure as I was sitting there that the government would change the rules on me and I'd never get my money out. I'd probably lose money. It would say I was the evil speculator who had burst the bubble. It would change the rules and nail me. I believe even if I had been Kuwaiti, it would have changed the rules on me as a short seller. It would have decided everybody had to suffer. This is one of the big problems with international investing. It's hard enough playing the game in many countries, but if you go into a place where your money is not freely exchangeable, you're just asking for problems. Kuwait? The inevitable happened. The market crashed. The clerks lost every penny of their tens of millions of post-dated profits, and then some. When we got to Francistown, I said, "Good God, look at this place." In addition to real shopping centers, the people had nice cars and trucks, new ones, lots of Toyotas. In Zimbabwe, the cars and buses had been old, and there hadn't been many of them. Here in Francistown, the buses were all new. A lot of construction was going up, with new buildings jutting up right and left. Bells started going off. Hey, something's happening here, something I ought to know about. What I had begun to sense, without knowing why or what the process was that the farther south we went, the harder the currencies became. It was a little like going through Central Europe. As one went from Bulgaria to Romania to Hungary, the currencies got sounder and harder. When one got to Austria, of course, the shilling was as hard as a rock. Not coincidentally, as we moved south, we also encountered more and more prosperity. Zambia had been more prosperous than Zaire. Zimbabwe had been yet more prosperous. Botswana was even better off than Zimbabwe. At the tip of the continent, South Africa was the economic powerhouse of Africa. It's Germany and California, all rolled into one. I learned there were lots of mines in Botswana: copper, diamond, copper-nickel, and coal. The country had only a little over 1 million people, yet it was about the size of Texas. Recent economic growth had been about 10% a year, 4 times as much as that of the United States. It was one of the world's top 3 producers of diamonds, which provided 75% of the foreign exchange and 60% of government revenue. The government's free enterprise orientation and conservative monetary policies had attracted some foreign capital, although its investors still tended to be wary of the country's dependence on South Africa. All in all, Botswana was intriguing. The Second World War did much to unleash black Africans' expectations. War is always a major watershed in history. The war changed many of the social, economic, and political balances of the continent. Many Africans went off to Europe, where they experienced a different mode of life. Back home, they had certainly observed the English colonialists. After the war, many foreigners moved into Africa. They brought prosperity, even though the Africans thought they were all colonialists out to exploit them. When the British were chased from Ghana in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah, the first black prime minister, pledged, "If we get self-government, we'll transform the Gold Coast into a paradise in 10 years. Outside of Ghana, many other blacks realized they weren't cashing in on the worldwide post-war prosperity. They naturally thought if they got rid of the outsiders, their oppressors, things would get better. They got rid of them, and things got worse. Typical of the New Democrats, Nkrumah turned dictator and jailed his enemies. He made court buffoons of the press and forced farmers to sell their output to his crooked cronies on the Ghana Cocoa Marketing Board, which destroyed the small farmers' farms with its low prices. By the time he escaped to Romania in 1966, he had created the pattern for African leadership for the next 20-odd years. All across Africa, post-colonial blacks got one man, one vote, but only once. In came the dictators. Their first act was to snatch everything they could from the exploiters, never mind building up their country's economies. To them, it looked as if they could make things all right forever if they could rip off the colonialists. They expropriated the lands and made themselves into what they called good communists and socialists. Many of them were simply perfectly ordinary dictators and tyrants who covered over what they were doing with the theory of the day, socialism, which they said was the sound social policy. This theory didn't work, however, any more than any statist theory of government can work. As their economies had fallen apart, the dictators had become more and more frantic to preserve what they had. To shore up their collapsing economies, they'd put on tariffs, import controls, regulations, licenses, and currency restrictions, everything they could think of. Once again, here were governments employing band-aids instead of dealing with their root problems. These measures provided short-term help, but their economies had continued to spiral downward. They had a reprieve with the commodities boom in the 1970s. Ironically, that boom itself was swelled by worldwide commodity shortages engendered by the colonialists leaving Africa a decade before. They had taken with them their knowledge of production techniques, administrative savvy, marketing contacts, and every scrap of capital they could repatriate to their homelands. Production of everything in Africa naturally declined. Before other mines and agricultural lands could expand to fill the economic void, prices rose dramatically. Without this boom in prices, these dictators, like the communists in the Soviet Union, would have been tossed out long before. By the late 80s, African leaders had no more room in which to maneuver. There were no more band-aids that would work. With new sources of minerals and agricultural products coming on stream, the commodities boom had fallen apart. Africans across the continent reacted by calling for change. Change meant democracy movements, since Africans were reacting to failed one-party dictatorships, as had happened in Boston in the late 18th century and in China in 1989. Today, only a handful of the 50-odd African countries, such as Zambia, Sao Tome, Mauritius, and Botswana, have open governments. My take is that unrest and clashing factions will produce many problems here. However, I don't think these problems will be as endless as those in Central Europe. Why not? For the past 45 or 50 years, Central Europe has been thinking, well, if we had democracy, we'd have prosperity. We in the West know democracy doesn't necessarily mean prosperity. Central Europe will probably go the same route as Africa, elect statist governments that will become more restrictive as things go wrong and put on controls to solve things. Thus, as in Africa, these Central European democracies will probably be stillborn. Ignoring the history of Africa and South America, they will head down the same path, the one of massive regulations, high inflation, ethnic warfare, bad currencies, and ultimately, dictatorships. In addition to the root problems of badly managed economies with irrational borders, Central Europe is filled with armaments, which will further complicate its political affairs. Ordinary Africans, like ordinary South Americans, have traveled the hard road long enough to know they must be vigilant about what form of government they allow. Unlike the Central Europeans, they now have the collective wisdom to know democracy isn't enough, to know certain political and economic policies won't work. They now realize they must no longer put up with oppression, that they must cut out regulations and controls, and that they must embrace a true open society. Those who are now running these countries are freeing up and privatizing the economies. No longer do they think the way to solve their problems is to centralize everything. They know state businesses don't work, and that the only way to gain any prosperity is to unleash the entrepreneur. Of one thing I am sure, Africa has to find its own solutions. 19th century colonialism, socialism, and communism have been tried and have not worked. True democracy might work here, yet it might not. What would work would be a system that would unleash the spirit of the people to do better, one that would allow the market to help them find their own true way. Even though neither they nor anyone else knows exactly where they are going, Africans are now on the right road for the first time in decades. We drove down to Gaborone, which was so well developed we could have been driving into Montgomery. Big buildings, paved streets, and good road signs. We exchanged currency and indeed didn't have to have our currency forms stamped. We spoke to bankers, brokers, and others in the financial markets. They all confirmed that the currency was freely convertible. Not only convertible, but hard. I wondered why it wasn't at least deteriorating like the lira or some of the other weak European currencies. One of the world's largest diamond mines was here, discovered only a few years before. The area also did a big business in ranching, even exporting cattle. In Central Africa we had seen only goats and pigs, but down here it was cattle. Raised on the open steppes, cattle had traditionally been a good livelihood here, the measure of a tribesman's wealth. Botswana had another comparative advantage over other African countries. A little more homework told me Botswana had a balance of payments surplus. In other words, every year it exported more than it imported. It even had a government budget surplus. This startled me. A government budget surplus would be rare anywhere, but was especially surprising in Africa. Botswana also had 3 years' worth of foreign currency reserves. This meant if it stopped exporting tomorrow, stopped earning foreign currency, Deutschmarks, rand, and dollars, it had enough foreign currency in the central bank to import at its present rate for 3 years. The same number of Sony TVs could come in, the same number of Caterpillar tractors. Contrast this to Italy, where the foreign reserves were measured not in years, but weeks. Indeed, many countries had only a few weeks or months of reserves, their governments living so hand-to-mouth that imports and currencies had to be rigidly controlled. I did more homework and found out Botswana really did have democratic elections. I was warned by the opposition politicians, those out of power, that the police were getting a little corrupt. The other thing that worried me about Botswana was that diamonds as a commodity were a short sale. I didn't think the diamond market would collapse anytime soon, but I certainly didn't want to be buying them. I felt I had to be careful because the government might be foolish with all that surplus money. It had built a big soda ash mine, which I wasn't convinced was a great business for this country. The government might invest in a joint venture with a large international company involving a show project only because it thought this was a proper way to do things, not as a sound way to make money. If that soda ash mine didn't work, it could be evidence that the government would fritter away the country's assets. Later I found out the soda ash mine wasn't working, which certainly gave me pause about investing further here. The government had opened up the mine, it had turned out soda ash, but it wasn't profitable. The press had quoted the government as saying the lack of profits was due to technical problems and the price of soda ash. Well, that explanation wasn't news to me, because I was sure this government, like every other, was never going to say it didn't work because it was its own fault. What I had to do was figure out whether the price of soda ash had really collapsed, or whether the government had been incompetent. On the plus side, the government had decided the country should be full of capitalists and that it needed a stock market. If it were going to develop industry, with a sound economy and jobs and all the rest, it recognized that it would need a stock market to raise capital. So it had passed laws, given tax incentives, and done everything it took to attract capital. It hadn't gotten too far with it. Since it was such a tiny market, there was only one stockbroker in the entire country. This broker was in a joint venture with Barclays Bank. That made me feel good, because I knew Barclays wasn't going to disappear soon. The entire stock market was in one guy's office, and he had only a half dozen employees. In fact, the entire market happened at one guy's desk. He matched up buy and sell orders. There were 7 stocks. I kept investigating. I went to see the government minister in charge of the stock market. He confirmed the government's intentions to aid the raising of capital. Yes, he said, we're going to build it up. We're going to continue to pass favorable laws to make it work well. We're going to give tax incentives for companies to go public and for people to buy and own shares. At least the government had recognized you could not just start a market and sell stock if there hadn't been one before. People would then say, "What is stock? I don't want any part of it." But if you said, "Stocks pay dividends and we won't tax them," it doesn't take people long to figure out, well, if I put my money in the bank, I pay taxes on it. But if I put it in this newfangled stock market, I don't pay taxes. So they'll put it in the stock market. This government had learned all these tricks. So I asked, who's against this? Who's against a stock market? You have to worry about this in any country. If there's an election and the other side comes in and says, "We're socialists and we don't like this stuff. We're going to change the rules," you get out then, if you can. No one, he said. The opposition is in favor too. I checked to see if these stocks were expensive. I looked at traditional measures like price-to-book value. Were the balance sheets sound? Did they pay a dividend? Were the price-to-earnings ratios high? Were they viable industries? Did they have a good future in Botswana? Things looked fine. I figured I was not going to lose any money. These stocks appeared cheap enough that the worst that would happen was they would sit there and give me no return. All I would lose, I hoped, was the opportunity cost. However, they all paid dividends, so it wouldn't be that unproductive. I would be getting dividends in a currency that was hard, or at least semi-hard. I had ascertained that Botswana had a sound economy and a sound social structure. I had ascertained that there was a new stock market, and that the government wanted it, and that the opposition also wanted to develop and encourage it. I had further ascertained that the stocks were cheap relative to dividends and other traditional stock market valuations. The final reason I invested here was because it was next to South Africa. I knew South Africa was at a crossroads, and that it could either become Argentina, the old Argentina where they printed money, had rampant inflation, and bought votes, or it would become open and sound. My analysis was that even though South Africa was Botswana's largest trading partner, and even if South Africa didn't make it, Botswana was still not going to be a disaster. I was not going to lose money in Botswana because its stocks were cheap and there were many other things going for it. If South Africa became dynamic with explosive growth, I was going to make a lot of money in Botswana, its northernmost neighbor, just as Canada, our neighbor, had become rich because of our markets. I came to think that Botswana was the best means of investing in South Africa because it didn't have the political, economic, and social dangers South Africa presented. I had all the potential of South Africa without its risk. I went back to the fellow who ran the stock exchange and bought all 7 stocks because I couldn't see what difference it made to pick and choose among them. Obviously, if you're starting a stock market, you don't start with Joe's Corner Liquor Store. You start with your largest, soundest enterprises, banks, and mines. And that's what they were. Not a whole lot of risk. In the beginning, I never go into these markets with a lot of money. I like to get my feet wet and see what kind of problems happen before I really pile in. Several more companies have come public since then. The same sort of companies, big ones, which I've also bought. When Joe's Corner Liquor Store in Francistown goes public, that will be the time to get out. I hope that will be a long, long time from now. Chapter 26. South Africa. We stopped at Kimberley, which I had long wanted to see. It is the site of the world's biggest man-made hole, called just that, the Big Hole. Back in 1871, diamonds had been found here on what used to be a large hill. From that date until the site had been exhausted in 1914, not only had the hill been carted away, but an enormous crater 800 yards deep and covering 37 acres had been dug into the ground. From all over the world, tens of thousands of people had poured in to make their fortunes. A number of them did get rich. More than 28 million tons of earth had been removed by hand and sifted, and about 6,000 pounds of diamonds had been found, 14.5 million carats, which at today's prices would fetch almost $200 billion. The De Beers mine across town looked as if it would match in size and be even more valuable than the Big Hole had been. In many cultures throughout history, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies have been more precious than diamonds. That diamonds were now more valuable than all other gemstones was a recent phenomenon. 100 years before, emeralds had been far more valuable. The De Beers Mining Company not only set up the South African diamond monopoly, it then set out to control the world price by keeping diamonds off the market. To build demand, the company came up with the extraordinarily successful advertising campaign, "A Diamond is Forever." That fixed in the public's mind that emotionally important events such as engagements, marriages, and special anniversaries needed a diamond to commemorate them. At least since ancient China and the time of Christ, business owners have tried to establish monopolies. The early Chinese emperors forbade anyone to export silkworms under the pain of death. The aromatic gum resin frankincense, which the wise men brought to Christ's birth, was the product of a monopoly. The 2 Arabian cities that produced the resin also forbade the export of the frankincense tree under punishment of death. Their monopoly kept the price at the equivalent of our price of gold, $400 an ounce, which is why frankincense was considered an extraordinary offering for a child in a manger. Nearby Angola was going through a terrible civil war. Even so, about 50,000 people were there digging up diamonds. Since Angola had no government, De Beers had not been able to get those miners under its control. Nevertheless, as soon as there was a government in Angola, the first thing it would do, both warring political parties had said so, would be to gain control of the diamond market, for the good of the country. They would pass a law that would say to the prospectors, "You can only sell your diamonds to us, the central buying unit, or go to jail." To the buyers they would say, "For your own good, we won't let you buy from the producers, otherwise the greedy capitalists will sell you counterfeits." Actually, the measures would serve to control the price and enable the government to get its mitts on all the hard currency. For the past 60 or 70 years, De Beers has succeeded in hiking the price of diamonds to an incredibly artificial level. There was never an economic justification for such a high price. Now that monopoly is starting to crack. Historically, De Beers has controlled 100% of production and sales. Today, that number is about 80%. In 30 years, diamonds will have less value than they have now. Certainly they are not a gemstone in which to invest. Why not? The law of supply and demand is once more hard at work. Since De Beers has set the price high, people are motivated to find diamonds. To maintain its high prices, De Beers has to buy from every producer who puts diamonds to them. If it refuses to buy, the producers will sell elsewhere. The price will crack and plummet. De Beers' inventory will become worthless. On the other hand, if De Beers continues to buy all the diamonds offered by independent entrepreneurs, it will eventually run out of money and have to stop buying. Either way, the price of diamonds will drop. Nothing lasts forever, certainly not artificial controls, whether concocted by bureaucrats or capitalists. De Beers' success depends upon its using the diamonds it has purchased as the collateral behind its bank loans. The banks, however, are waking up to this stupendous scam. Cautiously, they are wondering if they can tiptoe out the door before their peers also wake up and the exit becomes crowded. Perhaps the end is closer than we expect. At this writing, De Beers refuses to send annual reports to potential U.S. investors in an apparent attempt to keep its situation under wraps. My advice? Sell diamonds and buy emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. A factor complicating South Africa's relationship with the world is the international media's fascination with its problems. Journalists seem more excited by violence than anything else. The media are hungrily waiting for South Africa to blow up to give them a terrific story. What is unfortunate is that the media does not undertake any sort of detailed analysis of the issues. The blow-ups with the dictatorships in Zaire or Uganda were reported as flash fires, and the media moved on. However, the media have their way with South Africa, refusing to acknowledge that they are a part of the problem. This notion became clear to me when we visited Leon Lew, a white South African who ran his own political and economic think tank. He had analyzed the factors that had led South Africa into its present situation in a series of brilliant articles and best-selling books. His books point out that apartheid should be dismantled because it is a horrible distortion of the marketplace, hurting whites as much as blacks. He had set aside moral arguments in favor of economic ones. He looked at the reality and practicality of the situation and said, "Of course apartheid's immoral, but even if it's not a moral question for you, if you just want to be richer or face reality, this is ruining our country. It will lead to war, rebellion, and a host of other problems." Lew was selling white South Africans on the fact that they would be better off if they didn't have apartheid. In the West, we think of South Africa as a land of black and white conflicts, of which it has plenty, but it also has a multiplicity of political parties and interests, producing far more than bipolar racial conflicts. Normally, Tabitha and I don't look up people like Leon Lew, because we wanted our trip to be serendipitous, to encounter only the people we bumped into. However, South Africa was so interesting, and we knew so little about it, that this time we made an exception. His think tank was in a big old home he had converted into an institute. Naturally, the house, like every large house in Johannesburg, was behind gates and walls. Because of civil war, robbers, whatever, there were walls everywhere, with electronics and all sorts of modern security. Joburg was a walled city with walled homes. In the conference room, we described our trip. He said, "God, why aren't I doing this? As much as I like what I'm doing, why aren't I traveling with you?" Lew struck me as a committed, smart, and perceptive guy, the kind who noticed the true nature of the emperor's new clothes. He saw clearly what had caused his country's problems. I felt enormous rapport with him. As an illustration of what South African blacks could do, he described the local public transportation system. 20 years before, the government had had a monopoly on public transportation, fielding battered buses that didn't serve the population well. A system of gypsy cabs, minivans, and buses had sprung up. Since these gypsy drivers hadn't been allowed to use the government's bus stops, they'd employed a system of hand signals. Riders in the street would signal where they wanted to go, and drivers would respond with their hand signal. "No, I'm not going that way," or "This is the South Square bus." This spontaneous system had worked so well that over time the government had been forced out of the public transportation business. Now the private Johannesburg system is superb. Here is a classic case of customers and entrepreneurs meeting each other's needs over the objections of their common enemy, government regulations established for their own good. Lew and I both agreed philosophically that if we could get the government out of most activities, as in his transportation story, everybody would be better off. He had also demonstrated in his writings that the blacks in South Africa were historically far better farmers than the whites. This had been one reason why the land had been taken away from them. Apartheid originated at least partially from economic interests. It's hard to believe, but codified apartheid, another example of economic difficulties leading to ethnic strife, has existed only about 46 years. When South Africa was having economic problems after World War II, the politicians had decided to save the economy and themselves with a lot of new regulations, licenses, and requirements, a way to protect some businesses. The blacks had suffered the most in the end. The morass became more complicated as ever more racially divisive laws had been enacted to prop up the entire rickety, jury-rigged concoction. It was another example of statism, one that had taken on a life of its own as a racist policy. An international investor is forced to consider South Africa. It is such a marvelous country, chock-a-block full of commodities, with gigantic resources, huge assets, a wonderful climate, a big population, a large market, and a great infrastructure. In every way, South Africa is the California of Africa, in terms of geography, weather, size, variety, and potential. It not only has mountains and ocean frontage, it has amazing flowers, birds, and animals. I asked Leon what was the future of his homeland. His view was that apartheid was now crumbling under its own weight. Its restrictions on the economy had become so strangling that South Africans would have to start over. This meant, of course, that they would have to get rid of apartheid, because most of the country's regulations flowed out of solving the problem of how the whites could control competition, preserve their positions, and become prosperous at the expense of the blacks. A big problem here was the African Nationalist Congress, Nelson Mandela's party. Mandela's heir apparent in the ANC was about 40 years old and a communist. In the days when it was communism versus capitalism, the ANC naturally had chosen the communist side. After all, the colonialists had all been capitalists, and nobody wanted to agree with them on anything. The ANC still embraced the passé, old-time left-wing mentality, which, though it hadn't kept up with the world, still ran the party. When Mandela died or lost power, the younger people would take over. Many people in South Africa, especially the blacks, were of the radicalized "we are owed" mentality, just as they were in other African countries that had become liberated. You've stolen from us for 300 years, therefore we're owed. We're going to take everything away from you. Though not without justification, this attitude had destroyed economic development and spoiled these countries for everyone. Should the ANC come to power, its left-wing reforms would possibly set South Africa back a decade. My view is that the country might have to go through a period of wild money printing, taxes, and deficits before a sensible investor should invest there. There might be more racial strife and civil unrest. The height of that unrest, however, when every other investor is fleeing the country, might be the time to buy South Africa's currency, the rand. Assuming the ANC wouldn't have gone to complete statism, this could be the currency's low point for decades. Leon's view was more optimistic, and his could be right. He felt that one day Mandela's ANC would win the South African election, that eventually many whites and most of the blacks would vote for him. Leon figured the ANC would be in power for a single term of 4 or 5 years, depending on how the Constitution was set up. The ANC would be the rough political equivalent of the U.S. Democrats or Britain's Labour Party. After this single term, because of the ANC's international non-competitiveness, the South African equivalent of the Republicans would win the next election. Politics would settle down, and economic progress would reaccelerate. Not that the Republicans worldwide have all the answers. They don't. The two-party system leads to a rotation between the left and right wings of society, which tends to establish the stability that is the best environment in which to invest. When I reminded him of post-war Africa's one man, one vote once tradition, he responded that the world press would never let South Africa go the way of the myriad northern examples, such as Zaire, Kenya, and Zambia. I wasn't so sure the rest of the world had that much to say in the matter. Even if it did, there was still the unresolved threat of tribal civil war. While I was fascinated by South Africa and its possibilities, who wouldn't want to invest in the Germany or California of Africa on the ground floor? The best thing I could do was to wait until I was convinced of the nature of the coming change. An investor is better off doing nothing until he sees money in the corner just waiting to be picked up. One of the biggest mistakes most investors make is believing they've always got to be doing something, investing their idle cash. In fact, the worst thing that happens to many investors is to make big money on an investment. They are so flushed, excited, and triumphant that they say to themselves, "Okay, now let me find another one." They should simply put their money in the bank and wait patiently for the next sure thing. But they jump right back in. Hubris. The trick in investing is not to lose money. That's the most important thing. If you compound your money at 9% a year, you're better off than investors whose results jump up and down, who have some great years and horrible losses in others. The losses will kill you. They ruin your compounding rate, and compounding is the magic of investing. In Johannesburg, we stayed with an old college friend and his wife, Humphrey and Serenity Mullard. This was again an exception to our rule of not looking up old acquaintances, but I hadn't seen enough of him over the previous 25 years, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity. A white South African, Humphrey had become involved, on his return to his homeland, with Serenity, a black woman 20 years his junior. The two had lived together at a time when he could go to jail for the rest of his life for the crime of cohabitation. At Oxford, and even when he was president of the student body at his own South African university, he had been anti-apartheid. For years, he and Serenity had lived together in a white neighborhood in Johannesburg, 50 yards from a police station. In South Africa, he said, there was much more interracial dating than the rest of the world imagined. Now they were married, with a son. Serenity was a teacher in Alexandra, the hottest township in terms of violence, struggle, and bloodshed. Tabitha and I went to see what her school was like. Outside, the children played marbles on the well-swept earth, reminding me of my days shooting marbles back in the 3rd and 4th grades. Older boys played soccer the way we'd played baseball and football. The teenagers, however, didn't appear as lively, but seemed more withdrawn than we had been. Her classroom had about 40 desks, each jammed against the other. Her classes held 70 to 75 students, which meant only 40 had desks. The rest stood, milled around, or didn't come to school. All the windows were broken out. Fortunately, the weather was good here, so that didn't present a great problem. She taught the 4th grade. Her class brought back memories of my grammar school days in Alabama. Back then, we constantly made posters and put pictures on the walls. In Alabama in the 50s, there were atlases, charts, and other teaching aids pertinent to the work. Not here. If Serenity wanted chalk, she had to buy her own, as there was no budget for supplies. Here there was no bulletin board, no pictures, and no charts. The paint was peeling, and she had no books. She took us to the school library, and we were shocked it was called one. While it was the size of 3 classrooms, its metal shelves were almost empty, displaying only a handful of books. Its only magazines were Africa Today, a periodical from the Zulus, and another from the ANC local. We saw no other African periodicals, and certainly no foreign periodicals. 1 atlas and 1 encyclopedia, both old and tattered, lay on the shelves. Once there had been more, but they had been ruined either by usage and age, or stolen. We were introduced as visitors from New York. The personnel and teachers struck me as dispirited, even numb, which was not surprising. It was a hopeless situation. The school had 3,000 or 4,000 students, a few hundred books, 75 people in classrooms with 40 desks, and no materials. Earlier in the week, 3 or 4 students had been killed in riots, which certainly contributed to making the school unsettled and uneasy. As we moved through this depressing school, I thought a lot about teachers, how many good ones there were. They don't earn much money, and often not much respect. They still go in and teach every day. Many of the teachers who had helped me had taught their hearts out. Despite the backwardness of parts of Alabama in those days, they had believed in teaching and loved it. They had wanted everyone to learn. And I had learned an enormous amount from them, even though when I got to Yale I hadn't thought I'd learned much, and probably I hadn't, compared with someone from Hotchkiss. My teachers had insisted we master such basics as the multiplication tables and the rules of English grammar. Serenity's colleagues also wanted the kids to learn. They went in every day determined to teach the children something, knowing many students didn't want to learn, that the conditions were overwhelming, that it was a hopeless situation. Even if these students did learn something, their future wasn't bright. We were awed by Serenity's courage, that with no resources, no materials, and very little support from her school district, she too came to class every day, determined to make that day work. At last, we drove into Cape Town. We had now made it from the top to the bottom of the African continent, 5,000 miles as the crow flies, and covered almost 11,000 miles. The trip had been a sensory feast, everything from the Sahara's windswept moonscapes to the lush richness of Zaire's rainforests. Cape Town was such a beautiful modern city that we understood what a frontier Botswana still was. Even though South Africa was the most prosperous and well-developed country in Africa, I still have the strong sense that if Mandela's African National Congress gained power, the country would go the way of old Argentina after Peronism ruined it. It was a shame, but so many blacks obviously felt it was their turn to get something back that they wouldn't be looking toward long-term economic development. As an investor, what worried me about Africa was that if South Africa didn't turn out well, the entire continent could become Zaire. This was a country with a wonderful climate, lots of technical knowledge, good workers, and great opportunities. Nigeria, because of its natural resources, principally oil, once could have been the continent's economic engine. As a result of economic mismanagement, which had led to a resurgence of ethnic and religious pride, it was likely to split into 2 or 3 countries before its political problems were over. No country other than South Africa had the infrastructure, the heritage, the collective memory, and the capital base to be the engine of the African continent's growth. As roads went, we could have been in Kansas. We could have been in Europe. The phones worked. There was gas everywhere, and restaurants, hotels, hardware stores, and all the other amenities of modern life. Thus, South Africa had a leg up on China, which needed more infrastructure. We hadn't seen many vehicles in China, and in its western half, roads hardly existed. But South Africa had roads, highways, telephone lines, electricity, and an adequate water system. All this infrastructure existed because Cecil Rhodes and a few other fellows had stumbled upon diamonds and gold. If these fellows had stumbled on diamonds and gold in such profusion in Zaire, Zaire would have become an economic powerhouse. It wasn't just that Cecil Rhodes had exploited the blacks. He and his crew did, of course. They used cheap labor whenever they could. The real point was that the discovery of diamonds and gold forced capitalism to put in an infrastructure in order to get its profits out. This brought South Africa prosperity and gave it a base on which to build. People forget that back in our 19th century it was hard-bitten capitalists like Commodore Vanderbilt and Jay Gould who not only became fabulously wealthy by laying railroad track, but also built the infrastructure enabling America to make gigantic economic leaps. Cecil Rhodes did the same thing in South Africa. As another example of capitalism aiding infrastructure, remember that wonderful paved road back in Niger as we came out of the Sahara? The reason it existed was because it was needed by a local uranium mine. In third world countries, in fact everywhere, there is no better way to develop an infrastructure. If there are profits, somebody will put down roads and telephone lines. No politically correct way exists to lay down an infrastructure. Many of us would like to think bureaucrats from the World Bank can sweep into a country and figure out precisely what needs to be built in order to have that country develop successfully. Unfortunately, their projects tend not to be located in the right place economically. Often these bureaucrats will build a bridge over a river, but unless there's some potential economic activity to exploit that bridge, it will not raise the region's prosperity. Running water may be brought to a village because it's good for the people, but that doesn't necessarily lead to prosperity. The place to put roads, telegraph lines, and water systems is near beehives of economic activity, mines, factories, and cities built by entrepreneurs willing to risk their capital to take out profits. Is it likely a bureaucrat earning a secure $75,000 a year will make a better judgment of what will work economically than an entrepreneur about to risk his own money, reputation, and opportunity? I promise you, the entrepreneur will give the question far more thought and will examine 100 times more variables and problems than the bureaucrat will. The entrepreneur will make sure he can communicate with his investments, house his workers, and get his products out over a decent road. When you look back at the United States, you see the ideal pattern. Until 1914, America was the largest debtor nation in the world. Entrepreneurs had borrowed a huge amount of money in the 19th century to develop our infrastructure. We built railroads, canals, cities, and factories. Today, there is an immense hoopla, and correctly so, over our deficit. There's nothing wrong with being a debtor nation if you are putting the money into productive assets for the future, which is what we did in the 19th century. The Europeans sent their money to our country because they could make a lot of money off us. We got the payoff in the 20th century when we became the richest country in the world. This could happen to Zaire, too. If Zaire attracted entrepreneurs who would truly develop the country, in time its economy would become immensely powerful. Unfortunately, back in the 60s and 70s, Zaire had thrown out all the capitalists solely because they were capitalists and colonialists, or exploitative. Economically, 19th century America was like Africa or Siberia today. Then, of course, there were no currency controls, regulations, immigration policies, and visas. There were no United Nations studies and task forces saying money should be sent here and there. If the opportunity looked good, capital, which was fluid and without inhibitions, took advantage of it. Like water running downhill, capital flowed to wherever the return was the highest. Capital never cares whether you're black, white, communist, socialist, Christian, or Muslim. All it cares about is its safety and its profit. It goes where the opportunities are. Capital is not concerned whether it impregnates Israel or Egypt, electronics or diamond mines. With this in mind, the Russians could solve their problems quickly. Legalize private property, tax everyone modestly, and make their currency convertible, and their mess would straighten itself out in rapid order. Foreign capital would find that attractive. In the 60s and 70s, the communist countries, China, Albania, and that whole crowd, said, "No, we're going to do it on our own. We don't want any outside capital because then we'll be exploited like the Africans." The Africans said the same thing, but they were all looking at the wrong model. In the 19th century, America borrowed huge sums of money and invested it wisely. We didn't buy furs for the dictator. We didn't buy cars for Mobutu. The money went into productive assets, and we got rich. Thus, South Africa now has a leg up on every other place in Africa because of an infrastructure laid on by its exploiters, its true developers, an infrastructure any future government and all future generations will be glad to have. In the West, we hear that everything in South Africa would rapidly resolve itself if only the Europeans would leave so the real Africans could run South Africa. After traveling close to the ground through the black-run countries of Zaire, Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, the Central African Republic, the Congo, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, I was certainly not convinced that this was any inevitable path to African prosperity and social justice. I wondered who, in fact, were the real South Africans. In Johannesburg, the population was indeed black and white, but in Cape Town, it was multicultural and multicolored. 2 centuries before the English had arrived in the 19th century to mine gold and diamonds, European settlers called Afrikaners had settled the Cape of Good Hope, establishing Cape Town. Through a former student of mine, we met Hannes Meiberg, the 9th generation of a Northern European family that had arrived on the Cape more than 300 years before. His family, which owned the oldest vineyard in South Africa, had been in the Cape area longer than most every blacks. He invited us to have lunch at the vineyard, where we and his other guests sampled not only his wines, but also a number of competitors. It turned into an exuberant day that lasted long past lunch and ended in our dancing on the table. In fact, if it hadn't been for a yet more complicated dance that evening, which resulted in a fall and an injury to my back, that 10-hour lunch might still be going on. A day in bed gave me time to reflect on who were the real South Africans. Those blacks we'd seen crowding borders north of here to enter South Africa were typical of the immigration that had taken place over the past century. Black Africans from northern regions migrating south for mining and then industrial jobs. The earliest inhabitants of South Africa were the Khoisan peoples, called Bushmen and Hottentots by the white colonizers. Not large in number, they lived across much of what we today call South Africa, but were concentrated in the Cape Peninsula. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a rest stop at Cape Town for its trade to China, Indonesia, and India. Some Europeans spread out from the town to grow food for the settlers, called Boers, and to supply food for the company's ships, which provided the Boers with European consumer goods. As long as 250 years ago, South Africa, particularly the area around Cape Town, wasn't a black country. It was more of a melting pot than New York City is. Europeans pulled in here, particularly the Dutch, English, and Portuguese, as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and headed to China and India. Naturally, some stayed and settled. Chinese, Indonesian, and Indian traders heading west followed the same pattern. Many of these peoples intermarried. "Go back," one Indian shopkeeper said to me. "Where? I don't speak Hindi. My family's been here since the late 1700s. I speak only Afrikaans and English. I wouldn't have any idea where to go if things became impossible for me here." Force this shopkeeper and Hannes to go home, and they would no more know where to head than would 95% of Americans. The ancestors of these two had been on their continent far longer than most Americans have been on theirs. Hannes was no longer European. He and my new Indian friend were both African. The farther south we had gone in Africa, the more beautiful and prosperous Africa had become. At that time, of the sub-Saharan countries, I considered investing in only Cameroon, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. Despite everything you have heard about boycotts, Black Africa's trade with South Africa was booming. Even though Mobutu, the dictator of Zaire, was a leader of the boycott, we had bought South Africa's delectable wines throughout Zaire. South African products were available in every black country through which we had passed. These countries had wanted the boycott to continue so they could get there first and capture the South African market. For example, Zimbabwe's trade with South Africa had been doubling every year for at least 5 years. Here's my bullish case for Africa. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Soviets and the Americans had financed dozens of African regimes through the CIA and KGB. Today, there are no more struggles with communists or socialists, nor any money to finance them. The movement has died. Neither the Americans nor the Soviets are propping up guerrilla movements now. As a result of their leaders dying or simply stepping aside, African governments are collapsing, their people rising. The continent's status quo and its borders are ripe for change, which will bring some strife. Any wars that might follow will be short, however, since there are few armaments to speak of on the continent and little will to fight. In the political reformation to come, the Africans will adopt either the Western model or the Chinese model. That is, one mouthing social and political platitudes, but allowing every kind of vigorous free market activity. The borders in Africa are even now becoming rational. After years of war, Ethiopia and Eritrea have peacefully agreed on how to split into two countries. The border problems in the Sudan are working themselves out. Until we intervened, a similar process was happening in Somalia. As African problems get cleaned up, the entrepreneurs who already exist throughout Africa will be freed to develop real economies. Africa has huge natural resources. The commodity markets are depressed now, but someday the world will be desperate for Africa's resources, especially as production in the former USSR falls apart. Zaire, for instance, is wonderfully fertile. Let a seed fall from your hand, and it grows. Zaire used to export food, and it could again. Even Angola will bounce back. As for the future of South Africa, it all depends on how the political struggle plays out. What I know for certain is that big fortunes will be made on the African continent in the next 25 years. Without doubt, I'll be back in a few years to make more extensive investments.